Before we begin, this documentary is made for relaxation and sleep. We invite you to turn off your screen, close your eyes, and let history unfold quietly as the story of the past becomes your path to peace. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy walked into Florida's electric chair and confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe the real number was over 100. This wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. This was a handsome law student, a crisis hotline volunteer, a political campaign worker who women trusted. He used his charm to lure victims, his intelligence to evade police for years, and his charisma to defend himself in one of the most televised trials in American history. From his first kill in 1974 to his final confession tapes, this is the complete story of Ted Bundy, the serial killer who proved that evil doesn't always look like a monster. If you're fascinated by the psychology of serial killers and want to understand how someone like Ted Bundy could fool so many people, subscribe to Deep Sleep Documentary. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history so you can explore the minds of history's most notorious figures. Hit that subscribe button and let's uncover the truth together. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24th, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His birth certificate listed his father as unknown, though years later, his mother Louise would claim he was a sailor named Jack Worthington. The truth of Ted's paternity would remain one of many mysteries surrounding his early life, though some family members suspected his father might have been Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell, making Ted the product of incest. What is certain is that Ted's arrival brought shame to the deeply religious Cowell family in an era when illegitimate children were social pariahs. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted lived with his maternal grandparents in Philadelphia, raised to believe his mother was actually his older sister. His grandmother suffered from depression and received electroshock therapy, spending long periods unable to care for the household. His grandfather Samuel was a tyrannical figure with explosive temper who beat animals, swung neighborhood cats by their tails, and kept a large pornography collection in his greenhouse. Samuel was known for his racist tirades at the dinner table and his violent outbursts that terrorized the family. Young Ted witnessed and absorbed this toxic masculinity during his most formative years. In 1950, Louise took her son and moved across the country to Tacoma, Washington, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the Cowell household and start fresh where no one knew their story. She found work as a secretary and soon met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook and Army veteran who seemed to offer the stable family life she wanted for her son. They married in 1951, and Johnny legally adopted Ted, giving him the surname that would become infamous. Louise and Johnny went on to have 4 more children together, creating the large family that Louise had always wanted. But Ted never bonded with his stepfather. He found Johnny Bundy uneducated and beneath him, resenting the man who had replaced the grandfather he had looked up to in Philadelphia. Though Johnny tried to include Ted in father-son activities like camping and fishing, Ted showed no interest and increasingly withdrew into himself. The discovery that his sister was actually his mother, which he learned sometime in his teenage years, shattered what remained of his ability to trust the people around him. He would later tell his girlfriend that learning of his illegitimacy made him feel humiliated and deceived, though he claimed it didn't bother him much. Those who knew him well understood it was a wound that never healed. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Ted displayed troubling behaviors that would later be recognized as early warning signs of psychopathy. As a toddler in Philadelphia, he had once surrounded his sleeping aunt with kitchen knives, standing silently by her bed with a smile on his face when she woke up. Neighbors reported that he tortured and killed neighborhood cats, though these incidents were dismissed as boys being boys in that era. He would sneak out of the house at night to prowl through neighborhoods, looking in windows and searching through trash cans for pornography. He became obsessed with images of violence against women, combining sexual arousal with fantasies of control and domination. At school, Ted was bright but socially awkward, never quite fitting in with his peers. He had a noticeable speech impediment that made him self-conscious, and he was smaller than many of his classmates, leading to bullying that intensified his feelings of inadequacy. He threw himself into academics and skiing, activities where he could excel individually without needing the social skills that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. He became an accomplished skier and took pride in his athletic ability, one of the few areas where he felt superior to those around him. By high school, Ted had learned to mimic the social behaviors he observed in popular students. He became a skilled actor, learning to present a charming facade that hid his inner emptiness and rage. He worked on the school newspaper and volunteered for political campaigns, positions that gave him a veneer of civic engagement and respectability. Teachers saw him as polite and well-mannered, never suspecting the violent fantasies that occupied his thoughts or the nighttime prowling that would escalate over the years. In 1965, Ted enrolled at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. It was at the University of Washington that he met Stephanie Brooks, the woman who would become his obsession and, according to many psychological profiles, the blueprint for his future victims. Stephanie was everything Ted wasn't. Wealthy, sophisticated, confident, from an established California family with social standing. She represented the upper-class world that Ted desperately wanted to belong to, but felt forever excluded from because of his illegitimate birth and working-class stepfather. Ted became completely infatuated with Stephanie, transforming himself into the man he thought she wanted. He dressed better, improved his social skills, and presented himself as ambitious and destined for success. For a time, they were a couple, and Ted believed he had finally achieved the status and acceptance he craved. But Stephanie grew frustrated with Ted's lack of direction and what she saw as his immaturity. In 1968, after they had both graduated, she broke up with him, telling him he had no real prospects and that she couldn't see a future with him. The rejection devastated Ted and sent him into a depression that would reshape his entire identity. After the breakup, Ted dropped out of law school and spent months drifting, working minimum wage jobs and wallowing in his perceived failure. But something hardened inside him during this period. He decided he would reinvent himself completely, becoming the successful man that Stephanie and society demanded. He returned to the University of Washington and changed his major to psychology, the irony of which would not be lost on future criminal profilers. He threw himself into his studies with new intensity, earning excellent grades and impressing his professors with his intelligence and dedication. Ted became a work-study student at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he authored a pamphlet on rape prevention. He volunteered at Seattle's crisis hotline, spending his evenings talking desperate people back from the edge of suicide, earning praise from his supervisors for his compassion and communication skills. He worked on the re-election campaign of Washington's Republican Governor Daniel J. Evans, rubbing shoulders with political operatives and building connections he hoped would serve his future legal career. He even received a commendation from the Seattle Police Department for his work in recovering stolen items and helping to capture a purse snatcher. In 1969, Ted began a relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, a divorced mother working as a secretary. Elizabeth, who would later write a memoir under the name Meg Anders, was immediately drawn to Ted's charm and attentiveness. He was good with her young daughter, helped around the house, and seemed to offer the stable relationship she wanted. They moved in together, and for a time, Ted played the role of devoted boyfriend and father figure. But he was simultaneously rekindling his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, flying to California to see her, and presenting himself as the transformed man she had wanted him to become. In 1973, Ted was accepted to law school at the University of Puget Sound, the achievement he had been working towards since Stephanie's rejection. He contacted her, and they began seeing each other again, with Ted now appearing confident, successful, and headed for a promising legal career. Stephanie, impressed by his transformation, discussed marriage with him. Then, in early 1974, Ted abruptly ended the relationship without explanation, leaving Stephanie confused and hurt. Years later, she would realize she had served her purpose. Ted had proven to himself that he could win her back, that he could become the man she wanted. The rejection had been avenged. He never needed to actually marry her. The conquest itself was the goal. But the victory over Stephanie wasn't enough to satisfy whatever dark needs were growing inside Ted. The psychology classes had given him a framework for understanding human behavior that he used not to help people, but to manipulate them. The crisis hotline work had taught him how to read emotional states and say exactly what people needed to hear. The political campaigns had shown him how to present a trustworthy public image. And the law studies were teaching him how the criminal justice system worked, knowledge he would soon use to evade capture and defend himself in court. Throughout, This period of apparent success and reinvention, Ted's nighttime activities were escalating. He prowled through neighborhoods regularly now, perfecting his ability to move unseen through suburban streets. He disabled the interior lights in his Volkswagen Beetle so he could open the door without being noticed. He studied women's patterns, noting when they came and went, which houses had easy access, which windows could be jimmied open. He began breaking into homes, not to steal, but to watch women sleep, standing over their beds in the darkness, feeling the power of his presence in their most vulnerable moments. The fantasies that had sustained him since adolescence were no longer enough. The pornography and the mental images were losing their ability to satisfy the compulsion that drove him. He needed more. He needed the reality of absolute control, of possessing another human being completely, of having the power of life and death in his hands. The psychological literature he studied gave him the vocabulary to understand his urges as a need for dominance arising from his early humiliation and rejection. But understanding the source of his compulsion did nothing to diminish it. If anything, the intellectual framework made it easier to justify what he was about to do. To everyone who knew him in early 1974, Ted Bundy was a bright young law student with a promising future. He was the charming volunteer at the crisis hotline, the dedicated campaign worker, the attentive boyfriend, the helpful neighbor. He was handsome in a clean-cut, all-American way, with thick dark hair, expressive brown eyes, and a smile that put people at ease. Women found him attractive and trustworthy. Men saw him as a likable peer. Parents approved of him dating their daughters. This was precisely the mask Ted had crafted with such care over the years. But beneath that carefully constructed surface was a void where empathy and human connection should have been. Ted had learned to mimic normal human emotions and relationships, but he felt none of it genuinely. Other people were not real to him in the way that he was real to himself. They were objects to be used for his purposes, puzzles to be solved, obstacles to be overcome. The law degree and the political career and the respectable marriage were goals he pursued, not because he wanted them, but because they were what society said successful men should want. His entire life was a performance, and he was growing tired of the act. The perfect mask was about to slip, revealing the monster that had been hiding behind Ted Bundy's charming smile all along. And the first person to see what was underneath would not live to tell anyone about it. The first victim whose disappearance can be definitively linked to Ted Bundy was a woman whose name remains unknown even today. In the early morning hours of January 4th, 1974, Ted broke into the basement bedroom of a house near the University of Washington campus where 18-year-old Joni Lentz, a dance major and aspiring performer, slept peacefully. He bludgeoned her with a metal rod torn from her bed frame, then sexually assaulted her with the same weapon in an attack of shocking brutality. Joni survived, though she remained in a coma for 10 days and suffered permanent physical and neurological damage that would affect her for the rest of her life. She had no memory of the attack or her assailant. For Ted, the violence had been satisfying, but incomplete. He had lost control, given into frenzy, and left a living witness. Next time would be different. Exactly 1 month later, on February 1st, 1974, 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her basement bedroom in a house she shared with 4 other young women just blocks from where Joni Lentz had been attacked. Linda was a senior studying psychology, a radio announcer who delivered ski reports for a local station, and by all accounts, a responsible young woman who didn't take risks or associate with dangerous people. Her roommates noticed she hadn't come home, but initially assumed she had stayed at her boyfriend's place. When they entered her room the next day, they found her bed carefully made, her nightgown hanging in the closet, and her clothes gone. Everything suggested she had left of her own accord. But when Linda's parents reported her missing and police investigated more thoroughly, they discovered a horror that had been concealed by the tidy appearance of the room. When they pulled back the carefully arranged bedspread, they found the sheets and pillowcase soaked with blood. Large amounts of blood had pooled in the mattress, suggesting a violent head wound. The nightgown that had been hanging in the closet was also heavily bloodstained. Whoever had taken Linda had knocked her unconscious in her bed, then dressed her unconscious or dead body in clothing from her closet, remade the bed to delay discovery, and carried her out of the house in the early morning hours while her roommates slept upstairs. The level of control and planning demonstrated by the crime scene was chilling to investigators. Linda Ann Healy was the first victim Ted Bundy took from her bed, and whose body he kept. She disappeared completely, leaving behind only the blood-soaked evidence of violence and a family that would wait decades for answers about what happened to their daughter. Years later, during his confession sessions before his execution, Ted would describe this murder as his first complete kill, the first time he successfully abducted and murdered a victim without leaving witnesses or losing control. He told investigators he had watched the house for weeks, learning the routines of the women who lived there, identifying which bedroom had the easiest access. He described entering through the basement door with a crowbar, moving silently through the house to Linda's room, and striking her in the head with the crowbar while she slept. The planning that went into Linda's abduction revealed that this was not an impulsive crime of passion, but a carefully executed hunt. Ted had scouted the location, chosen his victim, brought the right tools, and prepared for how he would transport the body. He had disabled the interior light in his Volkswagen Beetle weeks earlier, allowing him to open the door in the darkness without drawing attention. He had removed the passenger seat entirely, creating a space where he could lay a body flat and cover it with a blanket. Everything about the crime showed premeditation and organization, the hallmarks of what criminal profilers would later categorize as an organized serial offender. For the investigators working the case, Linda Healy's disappearance was baffling. Young women didn't simply vanish from their locked bedrooms in the middle of the night in safe neighborhoods near a university campus. There was no obvious suspect, no jilted boyfriend, no evidence of stalking or threatening behavior. The violence suggested a stranger attack, but stranger attacks didn't typically involve this level of planning and control. The case went cold quickly, with no leads and no body to provide forensic evidence. Linda's parents appeared on television pleading for information, but no one had seen anything unusual that night. It was as if their daughter had simply ceased to exist. What investigators didn't know was that Ted Bundy had taken Linda's body to a remote location in the Cascade Mountains east of Seattle, an area he knew well from his skiing trips. He had kept her body for days, returning to it repeatedly to fulfill the fantasies that had been building in his mind for years. The reality of absolute possession, of having a victim who could never reject him or judge him or leave him, was even more intoxicating than he had imagined. When decomposition finally forced him to dispose of the remains, he scattered them across the mountainside, where they would never be found intact. Only years later would scattered bones be discovered and identified through dental records. 1 month after Linda Healy vanished, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson disappeared on the evening of March 12, 1974, while walking from her dormitory to a jazz concert at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Donna was a free-spirited student, interested in environmentalism and Native American culture, known for her long, dark hair parted down the middle and her bohemian style. She left her dorm room at 7 in the evening for a concert that was only a 5-minute walk away. She never arrived, and she was never seen again. Unlike Linda Healy's case, there was no crime scene, no blood, no evidence of what had happened. Donna had simply vanished, somewhere along that short walk across campus. Ted later confessed that he had been trolling the Evergreen State College campus that evening, looking for a victim. He had spotted Donna walking alone and simply approached her with some pretense, perhaps asking for directions or offering a ride to the concert venue. Once she was close enough, he had knocked her unconscious with a crowbar he kept concealed and quickly loaded her into his Beetle. The entire abduction took less than a minute, happening so fast that even if someone had been watching from a distance, they might not have realized what they were seeing. One moment Donna was walking across campus, the next she was gone. Her body was never found, and Ted later told investigators he couldn't remember exactly where he had disposed of her remains. The disappearances continued with horrifying regularity through the spring of 1974. On April 17th, Susan Rancourt, an 18-year-old freshman at Central Washington State College, disappeared after leaving a meeting of her German club. She was last seen walking toward her dormitory around 9 in the evening. Witnesses later reported seeing a young man with his arm in a sling, asking female students for help carrying his books to his car. Several women had declined, finding something off about his demeanor despite his friendly approach. Susan apparently agreed to help and was never seen alive again. The arm in a sling trick became one of Ted Bundy's signature methods for approaching victims. By appearing injured and helpless, he exploited the natural compassion and desire to help that most people possess. Young women who would never normally approach a strange man's car or walk with him to a dark parking lot felt safe doing so when that man appeared vulnerable and in need of assistance. The fake injury lowered their guard and made them willing to enter his personal space. Once they were close enough to the car, Ted would drop the act, produce a weapon, and force them inside. The entire interaction was carefully choreographed to use social norms and expectations against his victims. Roberta Kathleen Parks, known to her friends as Kathy, disappeared on May 6, 1974, from the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis. The 22-year-old was last seen leaving her dormitory in the evening. Once again, witnesses reported seeing a man with a sling on his arm, asking women for help with books near the area where Kathy was last seen. Once again, a young woman with long, dark hair parted in the middle vanished without a trace. The pattern was becoming clear to investigators across the Pacific Northwest, but without bodies or crime scenes, they had little to work with. They knew a predator was hunting on college campuses, but they had no physical evidence, no witnesses to an actual abduction, and no idea who they were looking for. Brenda Carol Ball, 22 years old, disappeared on June 1, 1974, after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, Washington, near Seattle. Unlike the previous victims who had been abducted from college campuses, Brenda was taken from a tavern parking lot late at night. Witnesses remembered seeing her talking to a handsome young man with dark hair and a charming smile who was asking women if they wanted to go to a party at a nearby house. Several women had declined the invitation, but Brenda apparently accepted. She left the tavern with the man and was never seen again. Her skull would eventually be discovered at a remote dump site east of Seattle, but her remains provided few clues about her final hours. What made Ted Bundy particularly difficult to catch during this early phase of his killing spree was the geographic spread of his attacks. He didn't hunt in a single area where police could establish a pattern and focus their investigation. Instead, he traveled extensively throughout Washington and Oregon, attacking on different college campuses and in different jurisdictions. Each police department was investigating their own missing person case, not realizing that they were dealing with a serial predator who was operating across state lines. The communication between different law enforcement agencies was poor in the 1970s, with no centralized database or computer system to link similar crimes. Ted exploited these jurisdictional boundaries brilliantly, staying one step ahead of investigators who didn't yet realize they were hunting the same man. The physical appearance of the victims revealed Ted's psychological fixation. Almost all of them had long dark hair parted in the middle, a style that closely resembled Stephanie Brooks, the girlfriend who had rejected him in 1968. The similarity was too striking to be coincidental. Ted was symbolically murdering Stephanie over and over, taking revenge against surrogates for the woman who had wounded his ego so deeply. But the victims were not interchangeable to him during the actual murders. In his confessions, Ted described each killing as unique, each victim as providing different elements of the fantasy he was acting out. Some he kept alive for hours or days, others he killed quickly, some he revisited repeatedly, others he disposed of immediately. The variety in his methods suggested he was experimenting, learning what satisfied the compulsion and what left him wanting more. By early summer 1974, at least 6 young women had disappeared from the Pacific Northwest under similar circumstances, and police were beginning to connect the cases. The term serial killer didn't exist yet in popular consciousness, but investigators recognized they were dealing with something unusual and terrifying. A task force was formed to coordinate the investigation across different jurisdictions. Police began warning college students to travel in groups, not to help strangers load items into cars, and to be suspicious of anyone who approached them with stories about injuries or broken-down vehicles. Campus security was increased. Dorm rooms were locked down in the evenings, but the warnings came too late for the women who had already disappeared, and they would prove insufficient to stop what came next. On July 14, 1974, Ted Bundy made his most brazen move yet, approaching victims in broad daylight at a crowded public park with dozens of potential witnesses around. Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington, was packed with families, couples, and young people enjoying the sunny summer weather. 23-year-old Janice Ott arrived at the park around noon to sunbathe and read. Witnesses later reported seeing a handsome young man with dark hair, wearing a white tennis outfit, with his left arm in a sling, approaching multiple young women and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. He introduced himself as Ted, and explained that his car was parked in the lot across the street. Several women declined, put off by something they couldn't quite identify despite his friendly demeanor and attractive appearance. Janice Ott apparently agreed to help. Witnesses saw her walk away from the beach area with the young man around 12:30 in the afternoon, heading toward the parking lot. She was never seen alive again. Her friends waited for her to return, assuming she would be back shortly after helping the man with his sailboat. When hours passed with no sign of Janice, they reported her missing to park rangers. But by then, Ted Bundy had already taken her to a remote location, murdered her, and returned to Lake Sammamish to hunt again. At approximately 4:30 that same afternoon, 19-year-old Denise Naslund left her boyfriend and friends at the park to use the restroom. She walked toward the facilities alone and never returned. Her boyfriend searched the area frantically, but Denise had vanished as completely as Janice Ott had earlier that day. The realization that two young women had disappeared from the same crowded park within hours of each other sent shockwaves through the community and finally garnered national media attention. This was no longer isolated missing person cases that could be explained away. This was a predator hunting in plain sight, bold enough to snatch victims from a public space filled with potential witnesses. The witnesses who had seen the man calling himself Ted provided police with their first solid leads. They described him as attractive, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair, well-spoken, driving a Volkswagen Beetle. He had approached multiple women with the same story about the sailboat. Some witnesses had been suspicious enough of his overly friendly demeanor to walk away, but they hadn't thought to alert authorities because nothing overtly threatening had occurred. The composite sketch created from witness descriptions showed a generic, handsome young man who could have been any of thousands of men in the Seattle area. But the name Ted, combined with the description and the Volkswagen Beetle, gave investigators something concrete to work with for the first time. Tips poured into the police hotline. Over 3,000 people called with potential leads, and the name Ted Bundy came up multiple times. His girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer called, reluctantly reporting that her boyfriend matched the description, drove a Volkswagen Beetle, and had been acting strangely. A woman who had worked with Ted on political campaigns called in his name. His psychology professor at the University of Washington called with concerns. But Ted Bundy was a law student with no criminal record, a volunteer at a crisis hotline, a politically connected young man from a respectable family. He didn't fit the profile of what investigators expected a serial killer to look like. The tips about Ted Bundy were filed away and not seriously investigated. It would be more than a year before police would connect the charming law student to the string of disappearances. The bodies of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were discovered on September 7, 1974, by a grouse hunter exploring a remote area near Issaquah, just a few miles from Lake Sammamish State Park. The remains were badly decomposed and scattered by animals, but enough evidence remained to identify both women and to reveal additional horror. Mixed in with their bones were the remains of at least one more unidentified victim, suggesting that Ted had been using this location as a dump site for multiple bodies. Investigators combing the area found more bones, skull fragments, and personal items from victims. But the decomposition and animal activity made it impossible to determine exactly how many women had been left there. This was the Taylor Mountain dump site, and it would yield grim discoveries for months as forensic teams carefully searched the wooded hillsides. The discovery of the dump site confirmed what investigators had feared. They were dealing with a serial murderer who had killed multiple women and disposed of their bodies in remote wilderness areas. The condition of the remains suggested they had been dead for months, and the fact that multiple bodies were found in the same location indicated the killer returned to familiar disposal sites rather than randomly dumping victims. This pattern of behavior would help profilers begin to understand the organized nature of the killer and his methodical approach to selecting, attacking, and disposing of victims. By the end of 1974, Ted Bundy had killed at least 11 women in Washington and Oregon, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher. Several missing person cases fit the pattern, but couldn't be definitively linked without bodies or evidence. The terror that gripped the Pacific Northwest was unlike anything the region had experienced before. Parents wouldn't let their daughters leave home alone. College enrollment dropped as families pulled their students from universities. Hitchhiking, which had been common among young people in the early 1970s, virtually disappeared. Overnight, The invisible threat of a predator who could strike anywhere, anytime, who looked normal and even attractive, fundamentally changed how people thought about safety and trust. What made Ted Bundy's success as a predator even more remarkable was that he was simultaneously maintaining his normal life during this period. He attended law school classes, worked at the crisis hotline, maintained his relationship with Elizabeth Clover, and socialized with friends and colleagues. No one who knew him suspected that the charming young man they saw every day was capable of the atrocities being reported in the news. He compartmentalized his life completely, keeping his hunting separate from his public persona. The mask never slipped in his daily interactions. He was always friendly, helpful, trustworthy Ted Bundy, the law student with a bright future ahead of him. But the need to hunt and kill was escalating beyond Ted's ability to control it. The intervals between murders were growing shorter. The risks he was willing to take were increasing. The daylight abductions at Lake Sammamish demonstrated that the compulsion was overriding his caution and his previously meticulous planning. He was beginning to believe himself invincible, smarter than the police, capable of talking his way out of any situation. This combination of escalating compulsion and growing arrogance would eventually lead to mistakes. But before that happened, Ted Bundy would expand his hunting ground far beyond the Pacific Northwest, leaving a trail of victims across multiple states as he fled from the investigation that was slowly closing in on him. The techniques Ted Bundy used to approach and abduct his victims were disturbingly effective because they exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology and social conditioning. Unlike the disorganized killers who attack impulsively and leave chaotic crime scenes, Ted was methodical and calculated in every aspect of his predation. He understood that successful hunting required him to lower his victims' defenses, to make them willing participants in their own abduction, at least in those critical first moments when they made the decision to trust him. The methods he developed through trial and error would become so infamous that they fundamentally changed how society teaches young people about personal safety. The fake injury technique was perhaps Ted's most successful innovation in the art of predation. By appearing in public with his arm in a sling, or walking with crutches, or wearing a cast on his leg, he transformed himself from a potential threat into someone who needed help. The injured person asking for assistance is one of the most powerful social scripts in human interaction. We are conditioned from childhood to help those who are hurt or disabled, to offer aid to those who appear vulnerable. Ted weaponized this pro-social instinct, using people's desire to be good Samaritans against them. Young women who would never normally approach a stranger's vehicle or walk with an unknown man to an isolated parking lot felt completely safe doing so when that man appeared injured and helpless. The performance involved in selling the fake injury required considerable acting skill. Ted had to appear genuinely encumbered by his supposed injury, struggling convincingly with books or packages or a briefcase. He had to show just the right amount of frustration at his inability to manage simple tasks, making potential helpers feel both sympathetic and needed. His demeanor had to communicate harmlessness and gratitude, never desperation or excessive eagerness that might trigger suspicion. He practiced these performances, refining his approach based on which women agreed to help and which declined. He learned to read body language and adjust his pitch accordingly, becoming more skilled with each attempt. The sling or cast also served a secondary purpose by making Ted appear less physically threatening. A man with one arm incapacitated seems incapable of overpowering anyone, especially to young women who have been taught to assess potential danger based on a man's physical capability. The injury suggested that even if something went wrong, the woman could easily escape or defend herself against someone who was already injured. This false sense of security was critical to getting victims close enough to his vehicle that he could drop the act and produce a weapon before they could react or flee. The transition from helpless injured man to violent attacker happened so quickly that victims had no time to process what was occurring or mount any effective resistance. Ted's choice of the Volkswagen Beetle as his hunting vehicle was also carefully calculated. The Beetle was one of the most common cars on the road in the 1970s, making it virtually invisible in parking lots and on streets. It had a friendly, non-threatening appearance, associated more with hippies and college students than with criminals or predators. The small size of the vehicle suggested harmlessness, making it seem less likely that anything dangerous could happen in such a compact, visible space. Women felt safer getting near a beetle than they would have approaching a van or a large sedan, vehicles more commonly associated with stranger danger in the public consciousness. But Ted had modified his beetle specifically for hunting. He had removed the passenger seat entirely, creating a space where he could force a victim down onto the floor and cover her with a blanket or jacket, making her invisible to other drivers or pedestrians who might glance into the car. He had disabled the interior light so the door could be opened without illuminating the vehicle's interior, allowing him to load an unconscious victim in darkness, even in populated areas. He kept a crowbar or tire iron within easy reach, concealed but accessible, so he could strike quickly when a victim was close enough. The cheerful exterior of the beetle concealed a carefully prepared trap. The approach itself varied depending on the situation and the victim. Sometimes Ted used the fake injury method. Other times he impersonated authority figures, showing a fake police badge and claiming to be investigating a crime or a suspicious person in the area. The authority figure approach exploited different psychological vulnerabilities, particularly people's conditioned obedience to law enforcement and their reluctance to question someone in a position of power. When Ted approached young women claiming to be a police officer, most of them never thought to ask for identification or verification. They simply complied with his instructions because he sounded authoritative and legitimate. Ted's physical appearance was one of his greatest assets in these approaches. He was genuinely handsome in a clean-cut, all-American way that fit perfectly with the image of a law student or a young professional. He had thick dark hair that he wore in the preppy style of the era, expressive brown eyes, and a smile that women found attractive and disarming. He dressed well, typically wearing slacks and button-down shirts or tennis whites, looking like someone who belonged on a college campus or at a country club. His appearance communicated safety and respectability, triggering all the class and cultural markers that society uses to determine who is trustworthy and who is dangerous. But it was Ted's verbal skills that truly set him apart from other predators. He was exceptionally articulate and charming, able to engage people in conversation effortlessly and make them feel comfortable in his presence. He had studied psychology and understood how to mirror people's speech patterns and body language, creating an unconscious sense of rapport and connection. He knew how to ask questions that made people feel heard and valued, how to offer just the right amount of personal information to seem open and trustworthy without revealing anything real about himself. Every interaction was a performance, and Ted was a master performer. The targeting of college campuses was strategic on multiple levels. Universities provided large concentrations of young women in the age range Ted preferred, typically between 18 and 25 years old. College students often walked alone between classes, the library, and their dormitories, providing numerous opportunities for approach without witnesses. Campus environments created a false sense of security, with students assuming they were safe within the bounds of their university and letting their guard down accordingly. The transient nature of college populations meant that a stranger on campus didn't necessarily stand out as suspicious, since new faces appeared constantly as students came and went. Ted also understood the rhythms and routines of campus life. Having been a student himself, he knew when classes let out, when libraries closed, when dormitory residents would be coming and going. He knew which areas were well lit and which parking lots or pathways had poor lighting and limited foot traffic. He could blend in perfectly, carrying books or a briefcase, looking like any other student or young professor. He could loiter in public areas without drawing attention, waiting for the right opportunity and the right victim to present themselves. The campus environment was essentially a hunting ground designed to his specifications. The selection of victims revealed Ted's psychological compulsions and his specific type. Almost without exception, his victims had long, dark hair parted in the middle, attractive faces, and slender builds. They resembled Stephanie Brooks, the girlfriend who had rejected him. But they also represented a broader idealized feminine type that dominated media and advertising in the 1970s. These were the women Ted felt he deserved, the women who represented success and status in his mind. By possessing them completely through murder, he experienced a sense of power and conquest that compensated for his feelings of inadequacy and his rage at being born illegitimate and working class. But the victims were not random strangers to Ted, at least not psychologically. He stalked many of them before approaching, learning their names, their schedules, their habits. He read the student directories to find out details about their backgrounds and interests. He sometimes called them on the phone with pretexts before making his approach, testing their responses and gauging their vulnerability. This preliminary stalking allowed him to personalize his approach for each victim, making his initial contacts seem less random and more like a genuine friendly encounter. The familiarity he displayed, knowing their name or some detail about them, further lowered their defenses and made his approach seem less threatening. The late-night hunting patterns revealed both Ted's planning and his understanding of when women were most vulnerable. Most of his attacks occurred between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, the window when college students were returning from the library or social events, when darkness provided cover, and when fewer people were around to witness anything suspicious. Women walking alone during these hours were already aware of potential danger, but Ted's appearance and approach were so skillfully calibrated to seem non-threatening that he could overcome even heightened vigilance. The woman who was cautious enough to avoid a dark parking lot alone might still agree to help an injured man carry books to his car 50 yards away. When the charm approach failed, or when circumstances didn't allow for the elaborate performance, Ted was fully capable of blitz attacks that relied on speed and overwhelming force rather than manipulation. He carried weapons concealed in his vehicle or on his person, typically a crowbar or tire iron that could incapacitate a victim with a single blow to the head. These blitz attacks usually occurred when a victim was alone in an isolated area, when Ted could approach rapidly from behind and strike before the victim even knew she was in danger. The victims of blitz attacks often had severe head trauma, indicating the force Ted used to ensure immediate unconsciousness. The blitz attack method revealed a different aspect of Ted's psychology. While he clearly enjoyed the manipulation and the performance involved in getting victims to trust him, he was also capable of purely predatory violence that had nothing to do with charm or seduction. This versatility made him more dangerous than killers who relied on a single approach. If one method wasn't working, or if circumstances changed, Ted could adapt quickly and employ whatever technique the situation demanded. He was not locked into a rigid pattern of behavior, but could improvise and adjust based on opportunity and risk assessment. The psychological impact of Ted Bundy's methods extended far beyond his actual victims. The realization that a serial killer could look like Ted Bundy, could be charming and educated and attractive, fundamentally challenged societal assumptions about what dangerous people look like. Prior to Bundy, the public image of a serial killer was generally a social misfit, someone whose appearance or behavior immediately marked them as aberrant and threatening.
Ted proved that the most dangerous predators could hide in plain sight, could be the friendly neighbor or the helpful stranger, or the attractive man at the bar. This revelation created a pervasive sense of paranoia that persists to this day. The term Ted Bundy effect
entered the lexicon of criminology and psychology to describe how attractive, charming individuals can exploit their appearance to commit crimes and evade suspicion. Studies of jury behavior showed that attractive defendants received more lenient treatment and were less likely to be convicted when evidence was ambiguous. Ted's ability to charm police officers, judges, journalists, and even his own defense attorneys demonstrated that physical attractiveness and verbal skill could override rational assessment of evidence and behavior. He became the quintessential example of the wolf in sheep's clothing, the monster wearing a human mask. For law enforcement, Ted Bundy's methods represented a new and terrifying evolution in serial predation. Unlike disorganized killers who attacked impulsively and left abundant forensic evidence, Ted was methodical and careful. He selected victims who didn't know him, minimizing the chance of witnesses who could connect him to the victim. He approached them in public places where his initial contact appeared innocent, so even witnesses couldn't identify the moment when something criminal occurred. He transported victims to remote locations before killing them, separating the abduction site from the murder scene and the disposal site. This geographic separation made investigation exponentially more difficult because different jurisdictions handled different aspects of the crime. The disposal of bodies in remote wilderness areas was another calculated decision that demonstrated Ted's understanding of forensic investigation. Bodies left in the elements and exposed to animal predation decomposed rapidly, destroying forensic evidence like fingerprints, fluids, and fiber transfer. By the time most of Ted's victims were discovered, their remains had been scattered and compromised to the point where determining cause of death or finding trace evidence was nearly impossible. The remote locations also meant that bodies might not be discovered for months or years, if ever. Several of Ted's victims have never been found, their families left without answers or closure because the disposal sites were so remote and so well concealed. But Ted made one crucial mistake in his methodology, one that would eventually contribute to his identification and capture. He developed favorite disposal sites and returned to them repeatedly rather than finding new locations for each victim. This pattern meant that once investigators discovered one dump site, they often found evidence of multiple victims, establishing a clear link between cases that might otherwise have seemed unconnected. The discovery of the Taylor Mountain site, with remains from at least 4 victims, was a turning point in the investigation, confirming that a serial killer was operating and giving investigators a clearer sense of the scope and timeline of the crimes. The ritualistic aspects of Ted's post-mortem behavior remain largely unknown during his active killing phase, because he successfully concealed the full extent of his actions. Investigators found bodies, but had no way of knowing that Ted had often kept victims alive for hours or days before killing them, that he returned to the corpses repeatedly for sexual gratification, or that he engaged in elaborate rituals of grooming and posing the bodies. These aspects of his crimes only emerged during his final confession sessions years later, when he was desperate to delay his execution and traded information for additional time. The revelations shocked even experienced homicide investigators who thought they had seen the worst of human depravity. The evolution of Ted's methods over time showed both increasing confidence and escalating compulsion. His early attacks were careful and planned, carried out in darkness with minimal risk of witnesses. But as his success continued, he grew bolder, attacking in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park, approaching multiple women in sequence until one agreed to help him. This escalation suggested that the psychological satisfaction he gained from the murders was diminishing, requiring him to take greater risks and act more frequently to achieve the same level of gratification. The addiction to killing was progressing, and Ted's ability to control the compulsion was deteriorating. The Lake Sammamish attacks marked a turning point in Ted's criminal career. By acting so brazenly in front of witnesses, by introducing himself by his real first name, by driving an easily identifiable vehicle, he had finally made mistakes significant enough that investigators had concrete leads to follow. The composite sketches and the name Ted would eventually lead police to consider Ted Bundy as a suspect, though it would take months before they took those leads seriously. But the net was beginning to tighten, and Ted's sense of invincibility was about to be tested by the reality of a coordinated multi-state investigation. As 1974 drew to a close, Ted Bundy had perfected his methods and developed a sophisticated system for selecting, approaching, abducting, murdering, and disposing of victims that had successfully evaded law enforcement across multiple states. He had killed at least 11 women, possibly many more, and he had never come close to being caught in the act. He believed himself untouchable, too smart and too careful to ever be captured. But the mistakes were accumulating, and the evidence was building. The charming law student who had weaponized trust and compassion was about to discover that even the most perfect predator eventually makes a fatal error. By the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy had established himself as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, though law enforcement still didn't know his name. The disappearances in Washington had made headlines and generated task forces, but Ted had already begun expanding his hunting ground beyond the Pacific Northwest. In September 1974, he enrolled at the University of Utah College of Law in Salt Lake City, ostensibly to continue his legal education, but also to escape the increasing scrutiny of police in Washington state. The move to Utah gave him access to fresh hunting grounds where police weren't yet looking for a serial killer, where young women hadn't yet been warned about the charming stranger with a cast on his arm. The first victim to disappear in Utah was 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox, a cheerleader at Olympus High School in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. On October 2, 1974, Nancy was last seen riding in a Volkswagen Beetle with an unknown man. Witnesses remembered seeing her talking to a handsome young man earlier that day, but no one thought much of it at the time. Nancy simply vanished, and her body was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the surrounding area. Years later, Ted would confess to her murder, but claimed he couldn't remember where he had disposed of her body, a statement investigators believed was a lie designed to maintain power over the victim's family by withholding the location of her remains. 17-year-old Melissa Smith disappeared on October 18, 1974, after leaving a pizza restaurant in Midvale, Utah, where she had been celebrating a friend's birthday. Melissa was the daughter of the Midvale police chief, a detail that added particular anguish to the case and ensured that her disappearance received extensive law enforcement attention. Her body was discovered 9 days later in a canyon east of Salt Lake City. She had been raped, sodomized, and strangled. Her face and skull showed evidence of severe blunt force trauma inflicted by a heavy object. Her nude body had been carefully posed and left in a location where it would be discovered, suggesting the killer wanted his work to be found and appreciated. The discovery of Melissa Smith's body gave investigators their first significant forensic evidence of the killer's methods and psychology. The level of violence inflicted on the victim, particularly the facial trauma, suggested extreme rage. The sexual assault established the crimes as sexually motivated. The careful posing of the body indicated the killer had spent time with the corpse after death, demonstrating a level of comfort and control that spoke to an organized offender who planned his attacks carefully. But despite this evidence, investigators still had no suspects and no clear leads about who was responsible for the murder of a police chief's daughter. On October 31, 1974, Halloween night, 17-year-old Laura Amy disappeared after leaving a cafe in Leahy, Utah, where she had been with friends. Laura had gotten into an argument with her companions and decided to walk home alone despite the late hour. She was last seen hitchhiking along the road, a common practice among young people in the 1970s, but one that made her particularly vulnerable to predators. Her body was discovered 27 days later in a canyon in American Fork, naked and badly decomposed. Like Melissa Smith, Laura had been raped and bludgeoned with a heavy object. The condition of her remains made it difficult to determine exactly how long she had been kept alive before being killed, but the level of decomposition suggested she had been dead for most of the time since her disappearance. The pattern of attacks in Utah closely resembled the Washington murders, but law enforcement agencies in different states weren't effectively communicating with each other in 1974. The computer databases and interagency coordination that would later become standard in serial killer investigations simply didn't exist yet. Each jurisdiction was investigating their own cases, not realizing that they were all hunting the same predator. Ted Bundy exploited these jurisdictional divisions brilliantly, moving between states and leaving behind a trail of bodies that wouldn't be connected until years later. On November 8, 1974, Ted made a critical mistake that would eventually lead to his first arrest, though he managed to escape capture on that particular night. 18-year-old Carol DeRanch was shopping at a mall in Murray, Utah, when she was approached by a well-dressed young man who identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told Carol that someone had attempted to break into her car in the parking lot and asked her to accompany him to the police station to file a report. Carol, conditioned to trust authority figures and having no reason to doubt the man's credentials, followed him to his Volkswagen Beetle. Once Carol was in the vehicle, the man claiming to be a police officer attempted to handcuff her, but he fumbled with the cuffs and only managed to secure one of her wrists. When Carol realized what was happening and began to struggle and scream, the man produced a gun and tried to force her to comply. But Carol fought back ferociously, managing to open the car door and tumble out onto the roadway. The man chased after her with a crowbar, taking a swing at her head that she barely managed to dodge. A couple driving by saw the struggle and stopped, and the attacker immediately fled in his Beetle. Carol DeRanch had become the first woman to escape Ted Bundy and live to identify him. Carol's description of her attacker and his vehicle matched the profile that was emerging from witness statements in Washington and Utah. She described him as handsome, well-spoken, approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair, driving a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. She had noticed that he smelled strongly of alcohol, a detail that suggested he had been drinking to build up courage for the attack. Most importantly, Carol had spent enough time with her attacker to provide a detailed description that would later be used to create composite sketches and eventually identify Ted Bundy in a lineup. But on the night of the attack, the man she knew as Officer Roseland disappeared into the night, and investigators had no leads on his actual identity. Later that same evening, just a few hours after the failed abduction of Carol DeRanch, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from the parking lot of Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah, where she had been attending a school play with her parents. Deborah left the auditorium during intermission to pick up her brother from a skating rink and was never seen again. Witnesses reported seeing a Volkswagen Beetle driving erratically through the parking lot around the time Deborah disappeared. A small key was later found in the parking lot that matched the handcuffs used in the attack on Carol Derange, physically linking the two incidents and confirming they were committed by the same person. Deborah Kent's body has never been recovered. The failed attack on Carol Derange was significant because it demonstrated that Ted Bundy was not infallible, that his methods could fail when victims fought back aggressively and when circumstances didn't favor him. Carol's survival also meant that for the first time, law enforcement had a living witness who had spent extended time with the killer and could provide detailed testimony about his appearance, his behavior, and his methods. This information would prove crucial when investigators eventually connected Ted Bundy to the Utah attacks, though that connection was still months away. As 1974 turned into 1975, Ted continued his legal studies at the University of Utah, while simultaneously hunting for victims across the Mountain West. On January 12, 1975, 23-year-old Karen Campbell disappeared from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass, Colorado, where she was vacationing with her fiancé and his children. Karen left the group briefly to return to her room to retrieve a magazine and never came back. Her nude body was discovered on February 17th along a dirt road several miles from the resort. She had been raped and her skull had been fractured by a blunt object delivered with such force that bone fragments were found driven into her brain. The isolation of the dump site and the careful cleaning of the body suggested the killer had taken his time and was confident he wouldn't be discovered or interrupted. The Karen Campbell murder was significant because it expanded the geographic range of the killings into Colorado and demonstrated that the killer was comfortable operating in resort areas and tourist locations, not just college campuses. It also showed remarkable boldness, abducting a victim from a crowded ski resort where her disappearance would be noticed immediately and where numerous potential witnesses were present. The fact that no one saw anything suspicious suggested the killer had the ability to blend in perfectly with his surroundings and could approach victims in ways that appeared completely innocent, even in public settings. In March 1975, two crucial developments occurred that began to crack the case open. First, forestry students discovered human remains on Taylor Mountain east of Seattle, in an area where Ted Bundy was known to have gone skiing regularly. The remains were badly decomposed and scattered by animals, but forensic examination revealed skulls and bones from at least 4 victims: Linda Healy, Susan Rancourt, Kathy Parks, and Brenda Ball. The discovery of multiple victims in a single location confirmed what investigators had suspected, that they were dealing with a serial killer who had a preferred dump site and returned to it repeatedly. The location gave investigators insight into the killer's geographic comfort zone and suggested he had extensive knowledge of the area's remote wilderness locations. The second development was the circulation of composite sketches based on witness descriptions from Lake Sammamish and from Carol Derange's attack in Utah. The sketches showed a handsome young man with dark hair, and law enforcement agencies began receiving tips from people who recognized the face. Among those tips were multiple calls naming Ted Bundy, including calls from his girlfriend Elizabeth Cluffer, who was becoming increasingly suspicious of Ted's behavior and his alibis for the dates when women had disappeared. But Ted Bundy was a law student with no criminal record, politically connected, and articulate enough to talk his way out of initial police interviews. The tips were noted but not aggressively pursued. Throughout the spring and summer of 1975, Ted continued killing. Julie Cunningham disappeared in Vail, Colorado on March 15th. Denise Oliverson vanished in Grand Junction, Colorado on April 6. Lynette Culver, age 12, was abducted from her junior high school in Pocatello, Idaho on May 6th. Susan Curtis disappeared from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah on June 28th. Each of these women and girls vanished without a trace, taken from locations across 4 states by a predator who seemed capable of moving invisibly through society. Most of their bodies would never be recovered, leaving their families without closure and law enforcement without crime scenes to process for evidence. The geographic spread of the murders demonstrated Ted's mobility and his understanding of how to exploit jurisdictional boundaries. By attacking in multiple states, he ensured that no single law enforcement agency saw the full scope of his crimes. A murder in Colorado was investigated by Colorado authorities who had no communication with Utah or Idaho investigators working similar cases. Without a centralized database or coordination mechanism, the pattern remained invisible even as the body count climbed. Ted understood this weakness in the system and used it to his advantage, becoming essentially invisible by operating across state lines. The selection of younger victims like Nancy Wilcox, Lynette Culver, and Deborah Kent marked an evolution in Ted's predation. While most of his victims were college-age women between 18 and 25, he was clearly willing to target high school students and even younger girls when the opportunity presented itself. This expansion of his victim profile suggested the compulsion was intensifying and his specific type preferences were becoming less rigid. The need to hunt and kill was overriding his previous selectiveness, a common pattern in serial killers as their addiction to violence escalates and requires more frequent fulfillment. The methods Ted used to dispose of bodies also evolved based on his experiences with law enforcement. Early in his killing career, he had left bodies in locations where they were likely to be discovered eventually, either because he wanted his work to be found or because he hadn't yet perfected his disposal methods. But as investigations intensified and forensic teams began processing dump sites for evidence, Ted became more careful about body disposal. Later, victims were buried, weighted and submerged in water, or left in such remote wilderness areas that they might never be found. Several of his victims from this period remain missing to this day, their families still waiting for answers about what happened to their daughters. The psychological toll on communities affected by these disappearances was immense. Parents in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho lived in constant fear for their daughters' safety. Young women changed their behavior dramatically, no longer walking alone, avoiding strangers, refusing to help people who appeared to need assistance. The paranoia was justified given the frequency of attacks, but it also represented a fundamental shift in how people interacted with each other and moved through public space. The social fabric of trust that allows communities to function was being torn apart by an invisible predator who could be anyone. Ted's ability to maintain his normal life while actively murdering women across multiple states was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his crimes. He attended law school classes, studied for exams, maintained relationships with Elizabeth Clover and other women, worked part-time jobs, and socialized with friends and classmates. No one who interacted with him daily suspected that the charming, intelligent young man they knew was spending his weekends hunting and killing women. The compartmentalization required to maintain such a double life suggested not just psychopathy, but a level of self-control and deception that most people are incapable of sustaining. The relationship with Elizabeth Clover became increasingly strained during this period. Though she didn't yet know the full extent of Ted's crimes, she noticed that he was often gone, overnight, with vague explanations about where he had been. She found strange items in his apartment, including crutches and a bag of women's clothing, that he couldn't adequately explain. He became evasive and defensive when questioned about his whereabouts or activities. Elizabeth's growing suspicions led her to call the police tip line multiple times, but each time she was assured that Ted had been investigated and cleared, that he was just one of many men who matched the general description of the suspect. What investigators didn't know at the time was that Ted was keeping trophies from his victims, items that he used to relive the murders and maintain his connection to the crimes. He kept jewelry, clothing, and identification cards from victims hidden in his apartment. He had taken Polaroid photographs of victims, though these were never recovered by police. Most disturbingly, he had kept severed heads from some victims, storing them in his apartment for weeks before disposing of them. These trophies were both evidence of his crimes and fuel for his fantasies, physical objects that he could return to when he needed to recapture the feeling of power and control that the murders provided. The frequency of Ted's attacks during this period, with sometimes only weeks between murders, indicated that the psychological satisfaction he gained from each killing was diminishing rapidly. The phenomenon is common among serial killers as their compulsion escalates. Early murders provide intense gratification that can last for months, allowing long cooling-off periods between attacks. But as the addiction progresses, the satisfaction fades more quickly, and the killer must hunt again sooner to achieve the same psychological high. By 1975, Ted Bundy was in the accelerating phase of his killing career, needing to murder more frequently and taking greater risks to fulfill the compulsion. The violence inflicted on victims was also escalating in intensity. Early victims like Linda Healy had been killed relatively quickly with blunt force trauma. But later, victims showed signs of prolonged torture, extended sexual assault, and extreme violence that seemed to serve no practical purpose beyond the killer's gratification. The facial trauma inflicted on many victims suggested rage and a desire to destroy the person's identity, to render them unrecognizable. This evolution in violence patterns indicated that Ted's psychological state was deteriorating, and his need for stimulation was requiring ever more extreme acts. By the summer of 1975, Ted Bundy had murdered at least 30 women across 7 states, though the exact number will never be known with certainty. He had evaded capture, despite leaving a trail of bodies across the American West, despite composite sketches circulating in multiple states, despite being named as a suspect by multiple people who knew him. His luck and his skill at manipulation had carried him through situations that should have led to his arrest. But luck eventually runs out, and skill can't compensate for the inevitable mistakes that accumulate when someone commits dozens of crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The net was tightening, and Ted Bundy's days of freedom were numbered. The full horror of what Ted Bundy did to his victims only became clear in the final weeks before his execution, when he began confessing details to investigators in a desperate attempt to delay his date with the electric chair. These confessions revealed that the murders themselves were only the beginning of Ted's crimes against his victims. What he did with the bodies afterward, the rituals he performed, the repeated violations he committed, represented a level of depravity that shocked even experienced homicide detectives who had spent decades investigating the worst of human behavior. The man who had presented himself as a charming law student was revealed to be something far more monstrous than anyone had imagined. Ted's obsession with his victims didn't end with their deaths. In fact, for him, death was merely the transition point where the victim became fully his possession, an object that could never reject him, never judge him, never leave him. He returned to the corpses repeatedly, sometimes within hours of the murder, sometimes days or weeks later, to engage in sexual acts with decomposing bodies. This necrophilia was not an occasional aberration, but a central component of his crimes, perhaps even the primary motivation for the murders themselves. The killing was simply the means to obtain a permanent sexual partner who could never say no, never express disgust, never threaten his ego with rejection. The dump sites Ted selected were chosen not just for their remoteness and low likelihood of discovery, but for their accessibility for his return visits. He needed locations he could reach easily, where he could spend time with the bodies without fear of being discovered or interrupted. The Taylor Mountain site east of Seattle, where the remains of Linda Healy, Susan Rancourt, Kathy Parks, and Brenda Ball were eventually discovered, was one such location. Ted had visited this area frequently for skiing and knew the logging roads and remote clearings intimately. He could drive there from Seattle in under an hour, park his Beetle on an isolated logging road, and spend hours with the corpses in complete privacy. During these return visits, Ted engaged in elaborate rituals that transformed the decomposing bodies into something closer to living girlfriends. He applied makeup to their faces, carefully choosing lipstick colors and eyeshadow to create the appearance he desired. He washed and styled their hair, shampooing and conditioning it, then arranging it the way he preferred. He painted their fingernails and toenails, selecting colors from a collection of nail polishes he kept for this purpose. He dressed them in clothing purchased specifically for these sessions, creating outfits that matched his fantasies. The level of care and attention he devoted to these activities suggested he was not simply using corpses for sexual gratification, but was attempting to create the illusion of a relationship. The decay of the bodies imposed limits on how long Ted could maintain these fantasies with each victim. As decomposition progressed, the bodies became less human in appearance and more difficult to manipulate into the poses and appearances Ted desired. The smell became overwhelming. The flesh began to liquefy and slough off. Insects colonized the remains. At some point, usually after several weeks, the body ceased to serve Ted's needs and he would abandon it, moving on to hunt for a fresh victim who could provide the unblemished canvas he required for his rituals. This cycle of murder, ritual visitation, decay, and abandonment repeated with each victim. But before abandoning a body completely, Ted often took trophies that would allow him to maintain a connection to the victim and the crime. He decapitated some victims and kept their severed heads, either in his apartment or in remote locations where he could visit them. These heads were objects he could return to, look at, touch, and use to fuel his fantasies when he didn't have access to a complete body. The heads retained their human features longer than bodies exposed to the elements, allowing Ted to maintain the illusion of a relationship for extended periods. When questioned about this during his confessions, Ted claimed he couldn't remember exactly how many heads he had kept, or what had happened to all of them, though investigators suspected he disposed of them when discovery became too risky. The apartment Ted rented in Seattle during his early killing spree should have been a crime scene overflowing with evidence. He kept victims' personal belongings there, jewelry and identification cards and clothing that he used as masturbatory aids when he couldn't access the bodies themselves. He stored the severed heads in his bedroom, likely in his closet or under his bed, returning to them regularly. He kept the makeup and nail polish and other grooming supplies he used on the corpses. Yet his roommate, who shared the apartment with him, never suspected anything unusual. Ted's ability to compartmentalize and maintain the appearance of normalcy, even while living surrounded by evidence of his crimes, demonstrated the depth of his psychopathy and his skill at deception. The Polaroid photographs Ted took of his victims represented another dimension of his need to possess and control. He photographed them during the murders, capturing their terror and their final moments. He photographed them after death, documenting the sexual acts he performed on their corpses. He photographed them during his return visits, creating a record of the decay process and his continued dominance over their bodies. These photographs were more than just souvenirs or pornography for Ted. They were proof of his power, visual evidence that he had possessed these women completely in ways that erased their autonomy and reduced them to objects existing solely for his gratification. The photographs were never recovered by law enforcement, despite extensive searches of Ted's residences and vehicles during his arrests. Ted almost certainly destroyed them when he realized he was under serious suspicion, eliminating the most damning evidence of his crimes. The loss of these photographs meant that investigators could never know the full extent of what Ted had done to his victims, or how many victims there actually were. Some of the women in those photographs might have been people who were never reported missing, whose disappearances were never connected to Ted Bundy, whose families never knew what happened to them. The photographs represented not just evidence, but the stolen identities of women whose stories would never be told. The sexual component of Ted's crimes evolved over time in ways that revealed his psychological deterioration. Early victims were killed relatively quickly, and the post-mortem sexual activity was somewhat limited, at least based on what forensic evidence and Ted's own confessions revealed. But as his compulsion escalated, the duration of captivity lengthened and the sexual violence intensified. Some victims were kept alive for days, held in his apartment or in remote locations, subjected to repeated assaults before finally being killed. The extended captivity served multiple purposes for Ted. It prolonged his sense of power and control, it allowed him to act out more elaborate fantasies, and it delayed the point where decay made the body unusable for his purposes. The keeping of victims alive for extended periods created enormous risks that Ted seemed increasingly willing to take. Holding a captive in an apartment or hotel room meant the victim could potentially be heard by neighbors or discovered by unexpected visitors. It required Ted to maintain constant vigilance and control over the victim, who might attempt escape or call for help during any moment of inattention. It left extensive forensic evidence in the location where the victim was held, including hair, fibers, bodily fluids, and fingerprints. The fact that Ted took these risks despite his otherwise careful planning suggested that the psychological gratification of extended captivity outweighed his concerns about detection. The psychology of necrophilia that drove Ted's crimes is among the rarest and most disturbing of paraphilias. Most serial killers who engage in necrophilia do so opportunistically, violating corpses simply because they're available and can't resist. But for Ted, necrophilia was apparently the primary motivation for the murders. He killed in order to create compliant sexual partners, and the death of the victim was the point where she became most useful to him. This inversion of normal human sexuality and relationships, where death rather than life made someone desirable, revealed the depth of Ted's psychological disturbance and his fundamental inability to relate to other people as autonomous beings worthy of respect. The specific rituals Ted performed on the corpses, particularly the application of makeup and the styling of hair, suggested he was attempting to recreate or maintain a specific idealized image of femininity. The victims needed to look a certain way for his fantasies to function effectively. The long dark hair parted in the middle was essential, echoing Stephanie Brooks, and representing the type of woman Ted believed he deserved, but could never possess through normal relationships. The makeup transformed the corpses into approximations of living women, allowing Ted to maintain the illusion that he was engaging with partners rather than objects. When decomposition made this illusion impossible to maintain, the body lost its utility and was abandoned. The confession sessions where Ted revealed these details were excruciating for the investigators who conducted them. Bob Keppel and Dave Reichert from the King County Sheriff's Office, along with other detectives from multiple jurisdictions, spent hours listening to Ted describe in clinical detail what he had done to his victims. Ted spoke about the murders and the necrophilia in a detached, matter-of-fact tone, as if he were describing perfectly normal activities rather than acts of extreme depravity. He showed no remorse or emotional connection to the suffering he had caused. The victims were objects in his narrative, things he had used rather than people he had destroyed. The detectives found themselves struggling to maintain professional composure while listening to descriptions that challenged their ability to understand human evil. Ted's willingness to confess these details in the final weeks before his execution was purely strategic. He understood that these confessions were the only leverage he had left, the only commodity he could trade for additional time alive. He parceled out information carefully, revealing just enough to keep investigators interested and hoping for more, but withholding key details about victim identities and body locations that families desperately wanted to know. He was playing a game even in his final days, using the family's need for closure and law enforcement's desire to solve cases as bargaining chips in his attempt to forestall the inevitable execution. The manipulation continued until his very last breath. The families of victims who learned about the necrophilia and the post-mortem rituals experienced a new dimension of trauma. It was horrifying enough to know that their daughters had been murdered, learning that their bodies had been repeatedly violated, that they had been used as sexual objects for weeks or months after death, that their remains had been treated with such contempt and degradation, compounded the grief in ways that are difficult to comprehend. Some families chose not to listen to the details of the confessions, preferring to remember their loved ones as they were in life rather than as objects in Ted Bundy's twisted fantasies. Others needed to know everything, feeling that only complete knowledge could provide the closure necessary to begin healing. The public revelation of Ted's necrophilia changed how he was perceived even by those who had followed his case closely. The charming law student who had defended himself in court, who had fathered a child on death row, who gave interviews and maintained his innocence, was revealed to be something far more monstrous. The mask had finally been completely removed, and what remained was a hollow shell of a man who had never developed the capacity for genuine human connection or empathy. Ted Bundy wasn't an aberration or an anomaly in the study of serial killers. He was the prototype of a new category of predator, the organized killer who could function in society while simultaneously engaging in acts of depravity that most people can barely comprehend. The forensic evidence recovered from the Taylor Mountain dump site and other locations where bodies were eventually discovered corroborated much of what Ted confessed about his return visits to corpses. The scattering pattern of bones indicated that bodies had been moved and repositioned multiple times, consistent with Ted's descriptions of returning to manipulate and pose the remains. The presence of personal items like jewelry and makeup at some dump sites suggested these locations served as stages for Ted's rituals rather than simply disposal sites. The condition of some remains showed evidence of cleaning and grooming that had occurred after death, supporting Ted's claims about washing hair and applying cosmetics to corpses. But many questions remain unanswered even after Ted's confessions and execution. How many victims were there actually? Ted confessed to 30 murders, but strongly hinted the real number was much higher, perhaps over 100. He told investigators to add a digit to whatever number they thought, suggesting the confirmed 30 should actually be 300. Most experts believe the actual total was somewhere between 50 and 100 victims, accounting for all the years Ted was active and all the locations where he lived and traveled. But without bodies or evidence, these additional victims remain unidentified, their families unaware that their missing loved one was murdered by Ted Bundy. The locations of many bodies remain unknown, despite extensive searches and Ted's supposed cooperation in the final confession sessions. He claimed he couldn't remember where he had disposed of certain victims, that the details had faded over time or been suppressed. But investigators suspected he was withholding information deliberately, maintaining some small measure of control by keeping these final secrets. Families of missing women who fit Ted's victim profile, but whose bodies were never found, live in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing with certainty what happened to their daughters, but suspecting the worst. Ted Bundy's refusal to provide complete closure represents one last act of cruelty against the people whose lives he destroyed. Evis. Necrophilia and the ritualistic violations Ted committed represent the darkest aspects of his crimes, the elements that are most difficult for normal people to understand or accept. These acts challenge our fundamental assumptions about human nature and the limits of depravity. They force us to confront the reality that some people are not merely misguided or traumatized, but are fundamentally broken in ways that make them incompatible with civilization. Ted Bundy spent his life wearing masks and performing roles, but beneath all the deception was simply a void, an absence of the empathy and connection that makes us human. The necrophilia wasn't a perversion of normal sexuality. It was the natural expression of someone who had never developed the capacity to relate to other people as anything more than objects for his use. Ted Bundy's ability to appear completely normal while committing horrific crimes is what made him so dangerous. If you're finding this deep dive into criminal psychology fascinating, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries on Jeffrey Dahmer and other notorious killers. Hit subscribe and the notification bell now. On August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy's careful world began to unravel in the most mundane way possible. A Utah Highway Patrol sergeant named Bob Hayward was working the graveyard shift in the suburbs of Salt Lake City when he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving through a residential neighborhood at 2:30 in the morning with its headlights off. When Hayward attempted to pull the vehicle over, the driver accelerated and ran a stop sign before finally pulling into an abandoned gas station. The driver who emerged was clean-cut and polite, a young man who identified himself as Ted Bundy and explained that he had been out for a drive because he couldn't sleep. He had just seen a movie at a drive-in theater, he said, and was simply driving around to clear his head. Sergeant Hayward's suspicions were immediately aroused by Ted's nervous demeanor and the implausibility of his story. No drive-in theaters were open at that hour. The neighborhood where Ted had been driving was residential, not an area someone would cruise through for relaxation. And most tellingly, when Hayward shined his flashlight into the Beetle, he saw that the passenger seat had been removed entirely. Ted claimed he had taken it out to transport something large, but he couldn't explain what or when. Hayward asked permission to search the vehicle, and Ted reluctantly consented, knowing that refusal would only intensify the officer's suspicions. The search of Ted's Volkswagen revealed items that no innocent person would have together in their vehicle at 2 in the morning. There were handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, a ski mask, rope, and torn strips of sheeting that could be used as ligatures. Ted explained each item individually in ways that sounded superficially plausible. The handcuffs were for protection. The ice pick was a tool he used for various purposes. The crowbar was standard emergency equipment. The ski mask was for skiing. The rope was for securing loads. But taken together, the collection represented a predator's kit, tools for abduction and restraint and control. Sergeant Hayward arrested Ted Bundy for evading a police officer and possession of burglary tools, having no idea that he had just apprehended one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ted was released on bail the following day, confident that his lawyer could handle the minor charges and that his life would return to normal. But the arrest had triggered something far more serious than Ted realized. When police ran his name through their system, they discovered he was among the suspects who had been named in connection with the Washington murders and the Utah disappearances. The composite sketches that had been circulating matched Ted's appearance closely. His Volkswagen Beetle was the same type of vehicle witnesses had described at Lake Sammamish and at the attempted abduction of Carol Duranch. Suddenly, Ted Bundy wasn't just a law student caught with suspicious items in his car. He was a prime suspect in multiple homicides and disappearances across several states. Investigators began building a case against Ted with renewed focus and energy. Carol DaRonch was brought in to look at a photo lineup, and she tentatively identified Ted as the man who had attempted to abduct her from the mall while impersonating a police officer. The identification wasn't certain at first, as Carol had been traumatized by the attack and nearly a year had passed since the incident. But as she looked at Ted's photograph more carefully and compared it to her memories of that night, her confidence grew. She agreed to view Ted in person at a physical lineup, where she would have the opportunity to see him move and speak, elements that might trigger stronger recognition than a static photograph could provide. The physical lineup was conducted in October 1975, with Ted standing among several other men of similar height and build. Carol DaRonch studied each man carefully, listening to them speak the phrases her attacker had used, watching how they moved and carried themselves. When she reached Ted, something clicked in her memory. The way he stood, the timbre of his voice, the expression in his eyes, all combined to create certainty where there had been doubt. Carol identified Ted Bundy as the man who had attempted to abduct and murder her. For the first time, Ted faced a witness who had survived and could testify against him. The invincible predator who had evaded capture for years suddenly found himself facing criminal charges that could send him to prison. Ted was charged with aggravated kidnapping in the Carol DaRonch case in October 1975. He maintained his innocence and hired a skilled defense attorney to fight the charges, confident that his intelligence and verbal skills would allow him to prevail in court. He believed Carol DaRonch's identification was questionable and that the circumstantial evidence against him wasn't strong enough to secure a conviction. He told Elizabeth Clofer and his friends that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that he was being persecuted because he fit a general description and had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many people who knew Ted believed him, unable to reconcile the charming young man they knew with the monster described in police reports. While Ted was preparing for his trial on the kidnapping charge, investigators in Colorado were building a murder case against him in the death of Corinne Campbell, the young woman who had disappeared from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass in January 1975. Hair samples found in Ted's Volkswagen were consistent with Corinne's hair. Witnesses placed Ted at the resort on the night of her disappearance. Credit card receipts showed he had purchased gas in the area around the time of the murder. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, and Colorado authorities issued a warrant for Ted's arrest on murder charges. But they agreed to wait until after the Utah trial concluded, allowing that case to proceed first and potentially provide a conviction that would hold Ted while the murder case was prepared. The trial for the attempted kidnapping of Carol DaRonch began on February 23, 1976, in a Salt Lake City courtroom. Ted waived his right to a jury trial and opted instead for a bench trial before Judge Stuart Hansen, believing he could better persuade a single judge than convince 12 jurors of his innocence. It was a strategic decision that demonstrated both Ted's confidence in his persuasive abilities and his fundamental misunderstanding of how his charm worked. The manipulation tactics that served him well in brief social interactions and with women who wanted to believe him were less effective with an experienced judge who had spent decades evaluating credibility and assessing evidence. Carol DaRonch's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She described in detail the events of November 8, 1974, explaining how the man claiming to be a police officer had approached her at the mall, convinced her to get into his Volkswagen, and then attempted to handcuff and abduct her. She described the struggle, her escape from the vehicle, the chase with the crowbar. She identified Ted Bundy as her attacker with certainty and conviction. Her testimony was emotional but credible, and she withstood Ted's cross-examination without wavering in her identification. The judge clearly believed her account and found her identification reliable despite the time that had passed since the attack. The physical evidence supported Carol's testimony. The crowbar found in Ted's car when he was arrested matched the description of the weapon her attacker had wielded. The handcuffs in Ted's possession were the same type and brand as the cuffs used in the attack, and the key found in the Viewmont High School parking lot where Deborah Kent had disappeared fit those handcuffs perfectly. Hair samples found in Ted's Beetle were consistent with Carol DaRonch's hair, suggesting she had indeed been in his vehicle. The totality of the evidence created a compelling narrative that Ted Bundy was the man who had attacked Carol and very likely the man responsible for Deborah Kent's disappearance and murder as well. On March 1st, 1976, Judge Hanson delivered his verdict. He found Ted Bundy guilty of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced him to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. It was Ted's first conviction, the first time he had faced real consequences for his crimes. The sentence was relatively light given the severity of the offense, but it ensured that Ted would be behind bars while investigators continued building cases against him for the murders in Washington, Utah, and Colorado. For the families of victims who had been waiting years for justice, the conviction represented the first step toward accountability, even if Ted was only being punished for one of his dozens of crimes. Ted was transferred to Utah State Prison to begin serving his sentence, but his incarceration would be brief. In October 1976, Colorado authorities extradited him to Aspen to face murder charges in the death of Corinne Campbell. The extradition meant Ted would be held in a Colorado County jail rather than the more secure state prison in Utah, a change in circumstances that Ted immediately recognized as an opportunity. County jails were less secure than state prisons, with fewer guards, less sophisticated security systems, and more opportunities for escape. From the moment Ted arrived in Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, he began planning how he would break out. The legal proceedings in Colorado moved slowly through 1976 and into 1977, with preliminary hearings and motions creating delays that kept Ted in the county jail for months. During this time, he was granted unusual privileges that reflected both the novelty of having such an infamous prisoner and the difficulty jail officials had reconciling Ted's polite demeanor with the horrific charges against him. He was allowed access to the law library in the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, where he could research his case and prepare his defense. He was permitted to use the phone extensively to coordinate with his attorneys and maintain contact with supporters. He was given books and writing materials and treated more like a celebrity inmate than a dangerous serial killer. On June 7, 1977, Ted was in the law library on the second floor of the Pitkin County Courthouse, ostensibly researching case law for his defense. His guard was in the room, but had become complacent during these library sessions, accustomed to Ted's polite compliance and scholarly focus on his legal work. Ted had spent weeks observing the layout of the courthouse, noting which windows could be opened, which areas had limited surveillance, which times of day had the least foot traffic in the hallways. He had been exercising regularly in his cell, preparing his body for the physical demands of an escape attempt. He had studied weather patterns and local geography, planning the route he would take once he was outside the courthouse. Every detail had been considered and prepared for. When the guard's attention was focused elsewhere for just a moment, Ted moved with surprising speed for someone who had seemed absorbed in reading law books. He opened a window overlooking an alley behind the courthouse, climbed out onto the ledge, and jumped. The drop was approximately 28 feet to the ground below, enough to cause injury but not necessarily fatal. Ted landed hard, twisting his ankle but not breaking any bones, and immediately began running despite the pain. He had timed the escape for early afternoon when courthouse employees were at lunch, and street traffic in downtown Aspen was relatively light. Within minutes of his jump, Ted Bundy had vanished into the Colorado mountains, a fugitive for the first time in his criminal career. The escape triggered a massive manhunt involving local police, county sheriffs, state patrol, and eventually FBI agents who were brought in due to Ted's status as a fugitive wanted for murder in multiple states. Roadblocks were established on all highways leaving Aspen. Police searched the mountains surrounding the town with dogs and helicopters. Residents were warned to lock their doors and report any suspicious activity. The national media descended on Aspen, turning the manhunt into a spectacle that dominated news coverage across the country. Ted Bundy, the serial killer who had murdered dozens of women, was loose in the mountains of Colorado, with unclear intentions and unknown capabilities for survival in the wilderness. For 6 days, Ted remained free, surviving in the mountains using skills he had developed during years of skiing and hiking in remote areas. He broke into mountain cabins, stealing food, clothing, and supplies while the owners were away. He stayed off main roads and trails, moving through dense forest where search dogs had difficulty tracking his scent. He survived cold nights at high altitude with minimal equipment, demonstrating resilience and outdoor knowledge that surprised investigators who had thought of him primarily as an urban predator. The escape showed a different dimension of Ted's capabilities, revealing that he could adapt and survive in challenging environments when motivated by the prospect of freedom. But 6 days of sleeping rough and scavenging for food took their toll on Ted's physical condition and his decision-making abilities. On June 13, 1977, he stole a car in Aspen and began driving erratically on Highway 82 toward Independence Pass. 2 deputies from the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office noticed the vehicle weaving across the road and pulled it over, initially suspecting a drunk driver. When Ted stepped out of the car, the deputies immediately recognized him from the thousands of wanted posters that had been distributed throughout the region. Ted Bundy's first escape had ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a routine traffic stop and the recognition of 2 alert officers doing their jobs. Ted was returned to custody and transferred to Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, a facility considered more secure than the Pitkin County Jail in Aspen. But the escape had taught Ted valuable lessons about what was possible and what mistakes to avoid in future attempts. He had learned that he could survive in the wilderness, that he could break into vehicles and structures when needed, that authorities' response to his escape could be evaded with planning and patience. Most importantly, he had learned that the county jail system in Colorado was vulnerable to a determined and intelligent prisoner who was willing to take risks. The first escape had been impulsive and poorly planned. The next one would be different. Ted Bundy's second incarceration in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, was meant to be far more secure than his previous detention. The authorities had learned from the courthouse escape and implemented stricter protocols for monitoring their infamous prisoner. Ted was placed in a cell on the top floor of the facility. His movements were more carefully tracked, and his access to areas outside his cell was limited. But the guards underestimated Ted's determination to escape and his patience in planning an attempt that would be far more sophisticated than his impulsive window jump in Aspen. What they didn't realize was that Ted had already begun studying the jail's architecture and routines, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. The county jail in Glenwood Springs was an older facility with design features that reflected a different era of incarceration, when security concerns were less sophisticated, and the primary goal was simply containment rather than prevention of determined escape attempts. The cells had suspended ceilings with removable tiles, creating a crawl space above the visible ceiling that extended throughout the building. This architectural feature was common in structures built in the mid-20th century, allowing access to plumbing and electrical systems without requiring workers to tear into walls. For Ted Bundy, that crawl space represented a potential highway to freedom if he could find a way to access it without alerting the guards. Ted began his preparations for the second escape by losing weight intentionally. He was already lean, but he needed to become thin enough to fit through the narrow opening that would allow him to access the crawl space above his cell. He stopped eating most of the meals provided by the jail, claiming he wasn't hungry or didn't like the food. The guards noticed his weight loss, but attributed it to stress and depression rather than recognizing it as preparation for an escape attempt. Over several weeks, Ted lost approximately 35 pounds, transforming his normally fit frame into something gaunt and angular. The weight loss went largely unremarked by jail staff who saw him daily and didn't notice the gradual change. While losing weight, Ted was also studying the ceiling of his cell with obsessive attention to detail. He tested the ceiling tiles carefully, determining which ones were loose enough to be removed quietly and which were more securely fastened. He observed the guards' routines, noting when cell checks occurred and how thoroughly they were conducted. He listened to the sounds of the building, learning to identify footsteps in the hallway and distinguish between different staff members based on their gait and timing. He was patient and methodical, gathering information over weeks and months while maintaining the appearance of a defeated prisoner who had accepted his fate. Ted also studied the architectural plans of the jail, which were available in the law library where he was still permitted to conduct legal research despite his previous escape. The blueprints showed the layout of the crawl space above the cells and revealed that it extended all the way to the jailer's apartment, which was located in the same building as the jail itself. This was the weakness Ted needed. If he could access the crawl space and navigate through it to the apartment, he could potentially enter the living quarters when the jailer was on duty downstairs and escape through a door that led directly to the street outside. It was an audacious plan that required precise timing and physical endurance. but Ted believed it was achievable. The schedule Ted developed for his escape attempt showed remarkable attention to detail and understanding of human behavior. He needed to make his move during the shift change between the evening and night guards, when attention was divided and the cell checks were less thorough. He needed to wait for a night when the jailer and his wife were both working downstairs, leaving their apartment unoccupied. He needed weather conditions that would provide cover for his escape once he was outside the building, and he needed to ensure that his absence wouldn't be discovered until morning, giving him the maximum possible head start before the manhunt began. December 30th, 1977, provided all the conditions Ted had been waiting for. The jailer and his wife were both working the evening shift downstairs in the main jail area, leaving their apartment empty. The weather forecast called for snow that evening, which would help cover his tracks and make pursuit more difficult. The guards were distracted by the approaching New Year's holiday, their attention focused on preventing holiday-related incidents rather than watching for escape attempts. Ted had confirmed through casual conversation that the guards would be playing cards in the common area that evening rather than conducting frequent cell checks. Everything was aligned for the escape attempt. At approximately 8 in the evening, Ted removed the ceiling tile in his cell that he had loosened over previous weeks. He pulled himself up into the crawl space, an effort that would have been impossible before his weight loss, but was now barely manageable. The space above the ceiling was cramped and dark, filled with pipes and electrical conduits and thick layers of dust that had accumulated over decades. The temperature was uncomfortably cold, as the crawl space was not heated, and winter air penetrated through gaps in the building's exterior. Ted had to move slowly and carefully to avoid making noise that would alert the guards below to his movement through the structure. The crawl above the jail cells extended for approximately 50 feet before reaching the area above the jailer's apartment. Ted navigated through the darkness using touch and his memory of the architectural plans he had studied. He had to squeeze around pipes and conduits, contorting his body to fit through narrow passages between structural beams. The physical demands were intense, requiring upper body strength and flexibility that Ted had maintained through exercises in his cell. Several times he had to stop and rest, lying still in the cramped space while listening for any indication that his movement had been detected by the guards below. When Ted reached the area above the jailer's apartment, he found another removable ceiling tile that allowed him access to the living quarters. He lowered himself carefully into the apartment, finding himself in a small bedroom that was mercifully empty. The apartment was modest, reflecting the limited budget of a county jail operation, but to Ted, it represented luxury and freedom compared to his cell. He moved through the rooms quickly, gathering items that would be useful for his escape. He found civilian clothing that belonged to the jailer, including jeans, a shirt, and a warm jacket. He located a small amount of cash, perhaps $20 or $30. Most importantly, he found the keys to the jailer's car parked outside the building. Ted changed into the civilian clothes, abandoning his jail uniform in the apartment. He walked calmly out of the apartment and down the stairs that led to the street entrance, the same stairs the jailer and his family used to access their living quarters. The door was unlocked from the inside, a security oversight that reflected the assumption that no prisoner could possibly reach this location. Ted stepped out into the snowy evening of Glenwood Springs as a free man, walking away from the jail with the casual gait of someone who had every right to be there. Below him, in the jail common area, the guards continued their card game, completely unaware that their most famous prisoner had just walked out the front door. Ted located the jailer's car in the parking area adjacent to the jail building. The keys he had taken from the apartment fit the ignition perfectly. He started the vehicle and drove away slowly, maintaining normal speed to avoid drawing attention. Within minutes, he was on the highway, heading out of Glenwood Springs, putting distance between himself and the jail before anyone discovered he was missing. The snow that had begun falling helped obscure his vehicle and his tracks, providing the cover he had hoped for when planning the escape. Ted Bundy was free again, and this time he had no intention of making the mistakes that had led to his recapture after the first escape. The escape wasn't discovered until approximately 12 hours later, during the morning cell check on December 31st. When guards found Ted's cell empty and saw the displaced ceiling tile, they initially assumed he was hiding somewhere within the jail and began a systematic search of the building. It wasn't until they discovered the disturbed crawl space and the evidence of entry into the jailer's apartment that they realized Ted had actually escaped the facility entirely. their faster. Discovery of the missing clothes and car keys confirmed that Ted had obtained civilian clothing and a vehicle, giving him a massive head start of nearly half a day before authorities even knew he was gone. The manhunt that followed Ted's second escape was far larger and more coordinated than the search after his courthouse window jump. This time, authorities knew they were dealing with a sophisticated escape planned and executed with precision, not an impulsive act. They knew Ted had civilian clothing, cash, and a vehicle, resources that would allow him to travel substantial distances before being detected. They knew he had demonstrated the ability to survive in wilderness conditions and to break into structures when needed. Most frightening, they knew he was a serial killer with dozens of victims, now loose and potentially hunting again. Roadblocks were established throughout Colorado, but Ted had already passed through them hours before they were set up. Police agencies across the country were notified and provided with Ted's description and photograph. The FBI elevated the case to their highest priority, recognizing that a serial killer on the run represented an imminent threat to public safety. The media coverage was intense, with Ted's escape becoming the lead story on national news broadcasts and generating headlines in newspapers across America. Ted Bundy was now not just a serial killer, but a fugitive who had embarrassed law enforcement twice and demonstrated a level of cunning that captured public imagination. Ted drove the stolen car through the night, heading east through Colorado toward the Front Range. He knew the vehicle would be identified and reported as stolen once his escape was discovered, so he needed to ditch it and find alternative transportation as quickly as possible. He stopped in a suburban Denver neighborhood and abandoned the car, then broke into another vehicle and hot-wired it using techniques he had learned years earlier. The new car was reported stolen later that day, but by then, Ted was already hundreds of miles away, heading east toward the Midwest and beyond. Over the next week, Ted moved across the country using a combination of stolen vehicles, hitchhiking, and bus travel. He passed through Illinois, stopping briefly in Chicago, where he considered settling but decided the city was too dangerous given the massive manhunt. He traveled through Michigan, staying for a night in a cheap motel and using a stolen credit card to pay for the room. He continued south through Ohio and Kentucky, always moving, never staying in one place long enough to be recognized or captured. The stolen credit cards he used along the way created a trail that investigators followed, but they were always days behind him, arriving at locations after he had already moved on. Ted's ultimate destination was Florida, a state he had visited during spring break trips in his college years and remembered as a place where he could disappear into the transient population of tourists and seasonal workers. Florida in January 1978 was crowded with snowbirds escaping the northern winter, creating a population influx that would make it easier for a fugitive to blend in without drawing attention. The state's extensive coastline and numerous small cities offered multiple options for establishing a new identity and settling somewhere law enforcement wouldn't think to look. Most importantly, Florida had the death penalty, and Ted had a perverse interest in challenging the system in a state where the stakes were literally life and death. On January 8, 1978, Ted Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, and checked into the Oak boarding house near the Florida State University campus using the name Chris Hagen. The boarding house was a ramshackle structure that rented rooms by the week to students and transients, exactly the kind of anonymous accommodation where a fugitive could blend in without attracting notice. Ted paid cash for his room, provided minimal identification, and settled in as if he intended to stay indefinitely. He was broke, having exhausted the stolen credit cards and cash during his cross-country flight. He was exhausted from days of constant travel and stress, and he was beginning to feel the familiar compulsion rising again, the need to hunt and kill that had been suppressed during his incarceration but never eliminated. The escape had given Ted approximately 30 days of freedom before his final capture. During those 30 days, he would commit the murders that would seal his fate and ensure his execution. The intelligent, careful killer who had evaded capture for years while maintaining a normal life was gone, replaced by someone desperate and deteriorating, unable to control his impulses or plan effectively. The escapes had demonstrated Ted's intelligence and determination, but they had also revealed his fundamental inability to stop killing, even when doing so guaranteed his eventual capture and death. The ceiling crawl in Glenwood Springs had given Ted Bundy his freedom, but that freedom would last less than a month before ending in the most violent and senseless murders of his entire killing career. Ted Bundy's first weeks in Tallahassee represented a brief period of attempted normalcy that quickly deteriorated into chaos and violence. He rented a room at the Oak boarding house under the name Chris Hagen, a thin alias that wouldn't withstand any serious scrutiny, but was sufficient for the low-rent accommodation that catered to transients and students who paid cash and asked no questions. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto the street. Ted shared a bathroom with other residents on his floor and had access to a communal kitchen that was rarely cleaned and smelled of old food and neglect. It was a far cry from the life he had imagined for himself as a successful lawyer, but it provided shelter and anonymity while he figured out his next move. Ted attempted to find legitimate employment during his first days in Tallahassee, applying for construction jobs and other manual labor positions that didn't require extensive background checks or documentation. He had some success securing day labor work, enough to buy food and pay his weekly room rent, but the physical demands exhausted him, and the wages were barely sufficient to survive. He stole whenever opportunity presented itself, shoplifting food and supplies from stores, using stolen credit cards for purchases until they were canceled, breaking into cars to steal wallets and valuables. The careful planning and risk assessment that had characterized his earlier crimes was absent now, replaced by impulsive opportunistic theft driven by immediate need. The compulsion to kill had been building inside Ted throughout his incarceration and his escape. He had gone more than 2 years without murdering anyone, the longest period of abstinence since his killing career began in 1974. The psychological pressure was immense, manifesting in restlessness and irritability, and an inability to focus on anything beyond the fantasies that occupied his thoughts constantly. He spent hours driving or walking around Tallahassee and the nearby Florida State University campus, observing young women, identifying potential victims, planning approaches and attacks. The hunting behavior was returning, and Ted was losing whatever minimal control he had maintained over his impulses. The area around Florida State University was perfect for Ted's purposes, filled with thousands of young women living in dormitories and sorority houses, many of them matching the physical type that Ted preferred. The long dark hair parted in the middle, the slender builds, the trusting faces of students who had grown up in safe suburban communities and had never learned to be suspicious of strangers. The campus had minimal security, with dormitory doors that were often left unlocked or propped open by students coming and going at all hours. The surrounding neighborhoods were quiet and dark at night, providing cover for someone moving through the area on foot. Ted scouted the location extensively, learning the layout and the routines, preparing for an attack that was becoming inevitable. On the night of January 14, 1978, Ted broke into several homes and apartments near the Florida State campus, stealing credit cards, money, and identification documents. The burglaries were clumsy and left evidence, suggesting that Ted's skills at avoiding detection were deteriorating, along with his psychological state. One homeowner awoke during the burglary and confronted Ted, who fled without taking anything. The recklessness of the burglaries showed that Ted was spiraling, taking risks that his earlier self would have recognized as foolish and likely to lead to capture. But the need for money and the escalating compulsion to commit violence were overriding his judgment and his survival instinct. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house near the Florida State University campus through a rear door that had been left unlocked by residents returning late from parties and social events. The 3-story brick building housed dozens of young women, most of them sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that a serial killer was moving through the hallways of their home. Ted carried an oak log he had picked up from a woodpile outside the building, a primitive weapon that would prove devastatingly effective in the confined spaces of the sorority house bedrooms. Ted moved through the darkened hallways of Chi Omega with purpose, checking door handles to find rooms that were unlocked. The first room he entered belonged to 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, a junior studying art history who was sleeping alone in her bed. Ted attacked her with the oak log, striking her head repeatedly with such force that her skull fractured and brain tissue was exposed. He then strangled her with a nylon stocking, though she was likely already dead or dying from the head trauma. The attack was swift and brutal, accomplished in virtual silence while Margaret's roommate slept in a bed just feet away, unaware that murder was occurring in the darkness. Ted left Margaret Bowman's room and moved down the hallway to another unlocked door. This room belonged to 20-year-old Lisa Levy, a fashion merchandising major who was known for her bright smile and her kindness to everyone she met. Ted attacked Lisa with the same oak log, delivering crushing blows to her head that caused massive skull fractures. He then sexually assaulted her and bit her repeatedly, leaving distinctive bite marks on her buttocks and breast that would later provide crucial forensic evidence. The violence inflicted on Lisa Levy went beyond what was necessary to kill her, suggesting that Ted was acting out fantasies that had built up during his years of incarceration when he had no access to victims. After murdering Lisa Levy, Ted moved to a third room where 21-year-old Kathy Kleiner and 21-year-old Karen Chandler were sleeping in separate beds. He attacked both women with the oak log, delivering severe blows to their heads and faces that fractured skulls and shattered jaws. The women began screaming despite their injuries, and their cries finally alerted other residents that something was wrong. Ted fled the room and ran down the stairs, leaving behind a scene of carnage and two young women who would survive but carry the physical and psychological scars of the attack for the rest of their lives. The entire spree inside Chi Omega had lasted approximately 15 minutes, time enough for Ted to murder two women and critically injure two others. As Ted was fleeing Chi Omega, he encountered a resident named Nita Neary, who was returning to the sorority house after a night out with her boyfriend. Nita saw a man walking quickly away from the building, carrying what appeared to be a log or club. She got a clear look at his profile and would later provide the description that helped investigators connect Ted Bundy to the Chi Omega murders. But in the moment, Nita didn't realize what she had witnessed. She entered the sorority house and discovered the scene upstairs, the screaming injured women, and the bodies of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. The horror of what had happened in Chi Omega that night would traumatize an entire community and make national headlines as one of the most brutal mass murders in American history. The police response to the Chi Omega murders was massive and immediate. Investigators from the Tallahassee Police Department, the Leon County Sheriff's Office, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement converged on the sorority house within minutes of the first emergency call. The crime scene was horrific, with blood spattered on walls and bedding, the oak log discarded in one of the rooms, and the injured survivors requiring immediate medical attention. The forensic team collected evidence methodically, photographing everything, gathering samples of blood and hair and fibers, documenting the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body that would prove to be the key piece of physical evidence linking Ted Bundy to the murders. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Both women had suffered severe head trauma, with multiple skull fractures and facial bones that had been shattered by the force of Ted's attack. They underwent emergency surgery to repair the damage and stabilize their conditions. Both would survive, though they faced months of painful recovery and reconstructive surgery to repair their shattered jaws and broken facial bones. The physical scars would heal eventually, but the psychological trauma of the attack would affect them for decades, making it difficult to sleep, to trust, to feel safe in their own homes. Ted had fled Chi Omega and returned to his room at the Oak boarding house, where he cleaned himself and changed his clothes. He had sustained minor injuries during the attack, including a cut on his hand and bruises from the physical exertion of bludgeoning 4 women in quick succession. He was covered in blood that belonged to his victims, and his clothing had to be disposed of carefully to avoid leaving evidence. But Ted was operating in a state of psychological disintegration now, no longer capable of the careful planning and evidence elimination that had characterized his earlier crimes. He left blood in the bathroom at the Oak, and he kept the clothing instead of destroying it properly, mistakes that would contribute to his eventual conviction. For 3 weeks after the Chi Omega murders, Ted remained in Tallahassee, still using the name Chris Hagen, still living at the Oak, incredibly managing to avoid detection despite the massive manhunt that was focused on finding the Chi Omega killer. He continued stealing to survive, using stolen credit cards and breaking into vehicles. He stole a Florida State University identification card belonging to a student and used it to gain access to campus facilities. He was drinking heavily, spending hours in bars around Tallahassee, drawing attention with his erratic behavior. and his tendency to talk too much when intoxicated. Multiple people would later report that they had encountered someone matching Ted's description during this period. Someone who seemed troubled and out of place, but who didn't trigger enough concern to warrant calling police. On February 9, 1978, 3.5 weeks after the Chi Omega murders, Ted's compulsion drove him to kill again. 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was a 7th grade student at Lake City Junior High School, a bright girl with her whole life ahead of her, completely innocent and trusting in the way that children are when they haven't yet learned that the world contains genuine evil. Kimberly left her classroom during first period to retrieve her purse from her homeroom, a routine errand that should have taken only minutes. She was seen walking across the school grounds toward the parking lot. She never returned to class, and she was never seen alive again. Witnesses reported seeing a young man acting suspiciously in the school parking lot around the time Kimberly disappeared. Some described seeing a man leading or carrying a struggling child toward a white van. Others reported seeing a man who matched Ted Bundy's description in the area that morning. But the reports were fragmentary and confused, the product of witnesses who had seen something but didn't realize its significance until later. By the time investigators pieced together what had happened, Ted and Kimberly were long gone, and the trail had gone cold. Ted had abducted Kimberly from the school grounds in broad daylight, likely using some pretext to get her to approach his stolen vehicle. He had been driving a white Dodge van that he had stolen days earlier, a vehicle that provided the enclosed space necessary to transport a victim without being seen. What happened during the hours after Kimberly's abduction remains unclear, as Ted gave conflicting accounts during his confessions and seemed unable or unwilling to provide complete details. What is known is that Kimberly was held somewhere for hours or possibly days, that she was sexually assaulted repeatedly, and that she was eventually murdered by strangulation or by having her throat cut. Kimberly Leach's body was discovered on April 7, 1978, nearly 2 months after her abduction, in an abandoned pig shed in Suwannee River State Park, approximately 35 miles from where she had been taken. Her remains were badly decomposed and had been partially consumed by animals, making it difficult to determine exact cause of death or to recover all forensic evidence. She was identified through dental records and clothing. The location where her body was found was remote and showed signs that Ted had attempted to conceal the remains, though his efforts had been half-hearted and ultimately ineffective. The discovery brought a horrific end to the search for Kimberly and confirmed what her family and investigators had feared from the moment she disappeared. The abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach represented a new low in Ted's criminal career. His previous victims had been primarily college-aged women, and while some had been teenagers, none had been children. Kimberly was 12 years old, a child who should have been safe at school, who had no capacity to recognize danger or protect herself from an adult predator. The murder crossed a line that made Ted Bundy not just a serial killer, but a child murderer, a designation that carried particular weight in the criminal justice system and in public perception. The crime ensured that even people who had found Ted's earlier murders fascinating, or who had been charmed by his courtroom performances, would turn against him completely. 6 days after Kimberly Leach's abduction, on February 15, 1978, Ted Bundy's final run as a fugitive came to an end in Pensacola, Florida. A patrol officer named David Lee noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving erratically in the early morning hours and ran the license plates, which came back as stolen from Tallahassee. Officer Lee initiated a traffic stop, and the driver initially complied, pulling over to the side of the road. But when Officer Lee approached the vehicle and asked for identification, the driver suddenly kicked open the door and attacked him, knocking him to the ground and attempting to flee on foot. Officer Lee pursued the fleeing suspect and called for backup. Additional officers arrived within minutes and joined the chase. Ted was captured after a brief struggle that left him with minor injuries and officers shaken by the violence of his resistance. When they searched the stolen Volkswagen, they found stolen credit cards, identification documents belonging to Florida State University students, and clothing that appeared to have bloodstains. The man they had arrested initially gave his name as Ken Misner, but fingerprint analysis quickly revealed his true identity. Ted Bundy, escaped murderer and fugitive wanted in multiple states, was finally back in custody. This time, he would never escape again. Ted Bundy's arrest in Pensacola on February 15, 1978, marked the beginning of a legal saga that would captivate the nation and transform the American criminal justice system's relationship with media coverage. Ted was transported to the Leon County Jail in Tallahassee to await trial for the Chi Omega murders. And from the moment he arrived, he began positioning himself not as a defendant fighting for his life, but as the star of a show that would play out on the national stage. The jails and courtrooms of Florida were about to become theaters where Ted Bundy would deliver the performance of his lifetime, using his intelligence, his legal knowledge, and his charisma in a desperate attempt to avoid the electric chair. The evidence against Ted for the Chi Omega murders was substantial and damning. Nita Neary, the sorority sister who had seen a man leaving the building on the night of the attacks, identified Ted in a lineup with certainty. Her description of the man she had seen matched Ted's appearance perfectly, and she never wavered in her identification, despite aggressive cross-examination. The bite marks on Lisa Levy's body provided physical evidence that linked Ted directly to the crime scene. Forensic odontologists could match the distinctive pattern of Ted's teeth to the bite marks with scientific precision, creating a form of evidence that was relatively new in criminal trials but devastatingly effective. Additional evidence came from Ted's own carelessness during his final weeks of freedom. The stolen credit cards found in his possession when he was arrested had been used at locations near Chi Omega around the time of the murders. Eyewitnesses placed Ted in the area on the night of the attacks. His behavior in the days following the murders, the drinking and the erratic spending, and the obvious psychological distress all painted a picture of someone who had committed horrific acts and was spiraling out of control. The case against Ted Bundy for the Chi Omega murders was among the strongest circumstantial cases ever assembled, with multiple forms of evidence all pointing to the same conclusion. Ted was assigned public defenders to represent him, experienced attorneys who understood the gravity of the charges and the difficulty of defending someone whose guilt seemed so obvious. But Ted had other ideas about how his defense should be conducted. He had studied law during his years in Utah and Colorado, and he believed his intelligence and verbal skills made him better equipped to defend himself than any attorney could be. Against the strong advice of his legal team, Ted decided to invoke his right to represent himself in court, with his public defenders remaining as advisory counsel, who could provide guidance but would not control the defense strategy. The decision to represent himself was vintage Ted Bundy, a combination of arrogance, narcissism, and genuine belief in his own superiority. He saw the trial not as a battle for his life, but as an opportunity to demonstrate his brilliance to a national audience. He believed he could outthink the prosecutors, charm the jury, and create reasonable doubt through the force of his personality and his command of legal procedure. He failed to understand that the skills that had served him well in brief social interactions and romantic relationships would not translate to a courtroom where trained prosecutors and an experienced judge would see through his manipulations. But Ted was incapable of recognizing his own limitations, and his ego would not permit him to defer to people he considered his intellectual inferiors. The trial for the Chi Omega murders began on June 25, 1979, in a Miami courtroom where the case had been moved due to extensive pretrial publicity in Tallahassee. Judge Edward Coward presided over the proceedings with a firm hand, managing the circus atmosphere that surrounded the trial while ensuring that proper legal procedures were followed. The courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and families of the victims who had waited over a year for this moment of accountability. Television cameras were permitted in the courtroom under Florida's progressive media access rules, making this one of the first murder trials in American history to be broadcast nationally. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch Ted Bundy defend himself against charges that could result in his execution. Ted's performance in court was a study in contrasts. At times, he displayed genuine legal knowledge and the ability to make coherent arguments about evidence and procedure. He cross-examined witnesses with some skill, identifying inconsistencies in testimony and challenging the admissibility of certain evidence. He gave an opening statement that was articulate and persuasive, at least to observers who weren't familiar with the overwhelming evidence against him. But at other times, his arrogance and his inability to control his ego undermined his defense. He argued with the judge, made inappropriate comments, and frequently seemed more interested in impressing the audience than in mounting an effective defense. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, They called Nita Neary to testify about the man she had seen fleeing Chi Omega on the night of the murders. They presented evidence about the timeline of events that night, establishing that Ted was in Tallahassee and in the vicinity of Chi Omega when the attacks occurred. They introduced testimony from the survivors, Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, who described the horror of waking up to being bludgeoned by an intruder. They showed the jury photographs of the crime scene and the victims, images so disturbing that several jurors visibly reacted with horror and disgust. The presentation was designed to counter any sympathy the jury might feel for the charming defendant representing himself. The bite mark evidence was the centerpiece of the prosecution's forensic case. Dr. Richard Souveron, a forensic odontologist, testified about the bite marks found on Lisa Levy's body and explained how he had matched them to impressions of Ted Bundy's teeth. The methodology was complex, involving photographs of the bite marks taken at the crime scene, dental impressions made of Ted's teeth after his arrest, and overlays that showed the distinctive pattern of Ted's dental structure matching the marks on the victim. Dr. Souveron demonstrated for the jury how certain unique characteristics of Ted's teeth, including a chipped front tooth and irregular spacing, were visible in the bite marks. The testimony was compelling and introduced forensic odontology to a national audience for the first time. Ted attempted to challenge the bite mark evidence during cross-examination, questioning the scientific validity of forensic odontology and suggesting that the matching process was subjective rather than objective. But his cross-examination was ineffective, revealing his lack of deep understanding of the science and his inability to shake Dr. Souveron's confidence in his conclusions. The jury appeared convinced by the forensic evidence, and legal observers noted that Ted's cross-examination had actually strengthened the prosecution's case by allowing Dr. Souveron to explain his methodology in even greater detail. Once again, Ted's arrogance had worked against him, creating opportunities for the prosecution rather than advancing his defense. Throughout the trial, Ted maintained a bizarre relationship with Carol Ann Boone, a former co-worker from Washington State who had relocated to Florida to support him during his legal proceedings. Carol was convinced of Ted's innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. She testified as a character witness during the trial, describing Ted as kind and gentle and incapable of the violence he was accused of committing. Her testimony was touching, but ultimately irrelevant to the legal question of whether Ted had murdered Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. What happened next, however, would become one of the most bizarre moments in American legal history. During Carol's testimony, while she was on the witness stand, Ted asked her if she wanted to marry him. She said yes. Ted then stated for the record that he intended to marry Carol Ann Boone, and he asked her to confirm that she accepted his proposal. Under an obscure Florida law, the public declaration of intent to marry in front of a legal authority constituted a valid marriage ceremony. Judge Cowart, apparently caught off guard by this development, allowed the exchange to proceed. Ted Bundy and Carol Ann Boone were legally married in the middle of his murder trial, a publicity stunt that generated headlines but did nothing to advance his defense or create sympathy among jurors. The marriage to Carol Ann Boone served multiple purposes for Ted. It demonstrated to the jury that he was capable of normal human relationships, potentially countering the prosecution's portrayal of him as a monster. It generated media coverage that might influence public opinion and potentially affect jury deliberations. It provided emotional support and validation for Ted during the most difficult period of his life, and it allowed Ted to maintain his delusion that he could have a normal future, that conviction and execution were not inevitable outcomes of the trial. The marriage was another performance in Ted's ongoing effort to control his narrative and manipulate the perceptions of everyone around him. The defense portion of the trial was brief and ineffective. Ted called few witnesses and presented little evidence to counter the prosecution's case. He suggested in his closing argument that the evidence was circumstantial and that reasonable doubt existed about whether he had committed the murders. He argued that the bite mark evidence was unreliable and that eyewitness identifications were notoriously unreliable. He appealed to the jury's sense of fairness and their obligation to presume innocence until guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt. But his closing argument lacked the passion and coherence needed to overcome the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. Ted had proven himself capable of delivering a competent legal defense, but competence was not enough when the evidence against him was so overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with their verdict on July 24, 1979. They found Ted Bundy guilty on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and 3 counts of attempted murder for the attacks on Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas, another Chi Omega resident who had been attacked but survived. The verdict was not surprising given the strength of the evidence, but it nevertheless marked a pivotal moment in one of the most publicized criminal cases in American history. Ted Bundy, the man who had evaded capture for years and escaped from custody twice, had finally been held accountable for his crimes. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately after the guilty verdict, with the same jury tasked with deciding whether Ted should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The prosecution argued forcefully for the death penalty, emphasizing the brutality of the murders, the suffering of the victims, and the danger Ted posed to society if he were ever to be released. They called family members of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy to testify about the impact of the murders on their lives, the permanent hole left by the loss of their daughters. The testimony was emotional and powerful, designed to humanize the victims and to counter any sympathy the jury might feel for the defendant who had charmed them with his intelligence and verbal skills. Ted's defense during the penalty phase consisted primarily of character witnesses who testified about his positive qualities and his potential for rehabilitation. Carol Ann Boone testified again, describing Ted as a loving person who had made mistakes but did not deserve to die. Former professors and colleagues spoke about Ted's intelligence and his potential contributions to society if his life were spared. But the testimony rang hollow in the face of the evidence about what Ted had done to his victims. The jury was not swayed by arguments about potential when the reality of Ted's actions was so horrific and so recent. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before recommending the death penalty for both murders. Judge Edward Cowart formally imposed the sentence on July 31, 1979, but not before delivering remarks that would become famous for their strange combination of condemnation and admiration. Cowart told Ted that he had thrown away his life and his potential, that he could have been a great lawyer and a productive member of society. He told Ted to take care of himself, a phrase that seemed jarringly inappropriate given that he had just sentenced Ted to death. The remarks reflected the cognitive dissonance that Ted Bundy created in everyone who encountered him, the difficulty of reconciling his charm and intelligence with the monstrous reality of his crimes. Ted's conviction and death sentence for the Chi Omega murders was followed by a second trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach. That trial took place in Orlando in January 1980, with Ted once again representing himself and once again failing to mount an effective defense against overwhelming evidence. Eyewitnesses placed Ted at Lake City Junior High School on the day Kimberly disappeared. Fibers from his clothing match fibers found on Kimberly's body. Soil samples from his vehicle match soil from the location where her body was discovered. The jury found Ted guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and once again recommended the death penalty. Judge Wallace Jopling sentenced Ted to death for a third time, ensuring that even if one conviction were overturned on appeal, others would remain to keep him on death row. The trials of Ted Bundy transformed the landscape of American criminal justice and media coverage of trials. The decision to allow cameras in the courtroom created a precedent that spread to other jurisdictions, making trials more transparent but also more theatrical. The extensive coverage of Ted's trials launched the modern true crime genre, establishing an appetite for detailed coverage of serial killers and their crimes that persists to this day. The forensic odontology evidence introduced in Ted's trial popularized bite mark analysis and led to its use in numerous other cases, though the technique would later be challenged as less reliable than it initially appeared. Ted's decision to represent himself became a cautionary tale used in law schools to illustrate the dangers of defendants refusing competent counsel. The aphorism that a person who represents himself has a fool for a client was never more aptly demonstrated than in Ted Bundy's trials. Despite his intelligence and his legal knowledge, Ted lacked the emotional distance and the strategic perspective necessary to defend himself effectively. His ego and his need for attention consistently undermined his legal interests, turning what might have been a difficult but potentially successful defense into a foregone conclusion. The decade of appeals that followed Ted's convictions demonstrated the complexity of death penalty litigation and the extensive procedural safeguards built into the system to prevent wrongful executions. Ted's appellate attorneys raised numerous issues: the pre-trial publicity that had made it impossible to seat an impartial jury, the admission of bite mark evidence that they argued was scientifically unreliable, the ineffectiveness of allowing Ted to represent himself when he was clearly not competent to do so. Each appeal was carefully considered by state and federal courts, with oral arguments and written briefs that ran to hundreds of pages. But ultimately, every court that reviewed Ted's convictions and sentences upheld them, finding that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that any errors in the trial proceedings were harmless in light of that evidence. As the appeals process wound through the courts over 10 years, Ted remained on death row at Florida State Prison in Starkey, living in a small cell for 23 hours a day with minimal human contact. Carol Ann Boone visited him regularly during the early years of his incarceration, and through an unexplained conjugal visit or contact visit loophole, she became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter named Rose Bundy in 1982. The existence of the child, conceived while Ted was on death row for multiple murders, added another surreal element to his story. But Carol eventually accepted the reality of Ted's guilt and the inevitability of his execution, and she stopped visiting him in the mid-1980s, taking their daughter and disappearing from public view to create a new life away from the shadow of Ted Bundy. The trial spectacle that Ted Bundy created was ultimately a distraction from the real questions his case raised about the nature of evil, the failures of the criminal justice system that had allowed him to kill for so many years, and the psychology of a man who could commit such horrific acts while maintaining an appearance of normalcy. The courtroom performances that captivated the nation revealed nothing meaningful about Ted, except his narcissism and his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. The real Ted Bundy was not the charming defendant cross-examining witnesses on national television. The real Ted Bundy was the man who murdered more than 30 women and felt nothing but satisfaction at their suffering. And that man was about to run out of legal options and appeals, bringing him face to face with the electric chair he had avoided for so many years. By January 1989, Ted Bundy had exhausted virtually every legal avenue available to him. The appeals process that had sustained him for a decade on death row was coming to an end, with courts at both the state and federal level consistently rejecting his claims of procedural errors and constitutional violations. His execution date had been set for January 24, 1989, at 7 in the morning, and unless he could produce some compelling reason for delay, he would be walking into Florida's electric chair in a matter of days. It was in this desperate final period that Ted finally began to cooperate with investigators, offering to confess to his crimes in exchange for additional time to provide details about unsolved cases. The confessions that followed would provide answers to questions that had haunted families and law enforcement for 15 years, but they would also reveal the full extent of Ted's depravity in ways that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. The strategy behind the confessions was transparent. Ted was trading information for time, parceling out details about murders and body locations in the hope that each revelation would earn him another stay of execution. He wanted investigators to believe that he possessed knowledge about dozens of unsolved cases, that his cooperation was essential to bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers about missing daughters. The tactic was manipulative and cynical, using the suffering of victims' families as leverage to postpone his own death. But investigators were willing to participate in the exchange because the information Ted provided, however self-serving his motivations, might solve cold cases and allow families to finally bury their loved ones. Bob Keppel, a detective with the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington, who had been investigating the Pacific Northwest murders since 1974, traveled to Florida to conduct interviews with Ted in the days before the execution. Keppel had spent 15 years pursuing Ted Bundy, first as an unknown suspect, described only as a handsome man named Ted, who drove a Volkswagen Beetle, then as a fugitive who had escaped custody twice, and finally as a convicted murderer on death row. The relationship between Keppel and Ted was complex, combining the adversarial dynamic of detective and criminal with a strange mutual respect, born of years of cat-and-mouse pursuit. Ted seemed to enjoy talking to Keppel, perhaps because Keppel had studied his crimes so thoroughly and could engage with him on an intellectual level that most people couldn't match. The confession sessions took place in small interview rooms at Florida State Prison, with Ted shackled and guarded, but allowed to speak freely about his crimes. The conversations were recorded on audio and videotape, creating a permanent record of Ted's final statements about his killing career. What emerged from these sessions was a portrait of a serial killer whose crimes were far more extensive and more depraved than even investigators had suspected. Ted confessed to murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida, providing details about victims who had never been identified and describing disposal sites where bodies had never been discovered. He spoke in a detached, clinical manner, referring to himself in the third person at times, as if describing the actions of someone else entirely. Ted confirmed that his first victim was a woman he abducted and murdered in 1974, though he was cagey about whether this was Linda Ann Healy or someone who came before her. He described the escalation of his urges, explaining how he had progressed from voyeurism and breaking into homes to watch women sleep, to physical attacks that stopped short of murder, to finally killing for the first time and discovering that the reality exceeded his fantasies. He talked about the planning that went into each hunt, the careful observation of potential victims, the selection of locations where he could attack without witnesses, the preparation of his vehicle and his tools. The level of premeditation he described contradicted any suggestion that these were crimes of passion or impulse. Every murder was calculated and deliberate. The details Ted provided about his return visits to corpses confirmed what investigators had long suspected, but had been unable to prove. He described driving back to dump sites repeatedly over periods of weeks, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to spend time with bodies that were in various stages of decomposition. He explained how he would wash the hair and apply makeup to maintain the illusion of life for as long as possible. He talked about dressing the bodies in clothing he had purchased or stolen, specifically for these rituals. He described the sexual acts he performed on the corpses, speaking about necrophilia as if it were a normal expression of sexuality rather than a profound perversion. The detectives listening to these confessions struggled to maintain professional composure, confronted with descriptions of depravity that challenged their understanding of human behavior. Ted admitted to keeping severed heads as trophies, confirming suspicions that had emerged from the discovery of isolated skulls at various dump sites. He described how he would talk to the heads, using them as substitutes for human companionship during periods when he didn't have access to fresh victims. He explained that the heads allowed him to maintain a connection to his crimes and to relive the murders through memory and fantasy. When asked what had happened to all the heads, Ted claimed he couldn't remember the disposal locations, though investigators suspected he was withholding information to maintain leverage. The revelation about the severed heads added a new dimension of horror to crimes that were already among the most disturbing in American criminal history. The estimated body count that emerged from Ted's confessions was staggering. He officially confessed to 30 murders across 7 states, providing enough detail about each case to satisfy investigators that he was telling the truth. But he strongly hinted that the actual number was much higher, perhaps double or triple the official count. He told Bob Keppel to add a digit to whatever number he thought was accurate, suggesting that if investigators believed he had killed 30 women, the real number was 300. Most experts dismissed the 300 figure as an exaggeration, but they generally agreed that Ted had probably murdered between 50 and 100 women during his active years. The exact number would never be known with certainty because Ted refused to provide complete information and because many of his victims were likely never reported missing or connected to his crimes. One of the most controversial aspects of Ted's final confessions was his claim that pornography had played a central role in the development of his violent fantasies and his progression to murder. In interviews given to Dr. James Dobson, a conservative evangelical psychologist who opposed pornography on moral grounds, Ted described how he had been exposed to violent pornography as a child and how this exposure had shaped his sexual development and his perception of women. He claimed that pornography had desensitized him to violence and normalized the objectification of women, creating a pathway from fantasy to reality that culminated in murder. He suggested that he was, in some sense, a victim of the pornography industry, that his crimes were the inevitable result of exposure to corrupting influences during his formative years. The pornography explanation was widely criticized by criminologists and psychologists as a self-serving attempt to deflect responsibility and to provide a simplistic cause for complex criminal behavior. Most serial killers are exposed to pornography without becoming murderers, suggesting that pornography alone cannot explain Ted's crimes. The explanation also conveniently ignored the documented history of Ted's early violence against animals, his voyeurism and breaking into homes, his profound narcissism, and his inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. These factors suggested that Ted's violent tendencies were rooted in his personality structure and his psychological development, not simply in his exposure to violent images. The pornography explanation was Ted's final attempt to control his narrative and to avoid taking full responsibility for choices he had made throughout his life. The interview with James Dobson was conducted on January 23, 1989, the day before Ted's scheduled execution. The conversation was filmed and would later be distributed by Dobson's organization as an anti-pornography teaching tool, a use that many critics found exploitative and misleading. Ted appeared calm and articulate during the interview, speaking thoughtfully about his crimes and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse for the suffering he had caused. But observers who had followed Ted's case closely recognized the performance for what it was, another manipulation designed to serve Ted's interests. By blaming pornography and presenting himself as a cautionary tale, Ted was attempting to reframe his legacy and to ensure that he would be remembered as something other than a monster who killed for pleasure. Ted's final hours on death row were spent meeting with his attorneys, his religious advisors, and the few family members who still maintained contact with him. His mother Louise visited him one last time, a meeting that was reportedly emotional and difficult for both of them. Louise had never fully accepted her son's guilt, clinging to the belief that Ted had been wrongly convicted or that the crimes attributed to him had been exaggerated. But by the end, even she seemed to understand that the execution was inevitable and that Ted's legal options had been exhausted. The goodbye between mother and son was final, acknowledging that they would never see each other again in this life. Ted refused his final meal, a symbolic gesture whose meaning was unclear. Some interpreted it as an expression of contempt for the ritual of execution, a way of asserting some minimal control over a process that was completely beyond his influence. Others saw it as evidence that Ted was finally confronting the reality of his impending death and had lost the appetite that normally sustained him. Whatever the motivation, the refusal of food in his final hours suggested that Ted's usual composure and his ability to maintain the charming facade were finally cracking under the weight of what was about to happen. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was awakened at 5 a.m. and given time to shower and dress for his execution. He was offered a final meeting with a chaplain, which he accepted, spending approximately 30 minutes in prayer or conversation before being led from his cell. He was clean-shaven and his hair was neatly combed, maintaining his appearance even in these final moments. Guards who escorted him to the execution chamber later reported that Ted was quiet but composed, walking without resistance and showing no obvious signs of fear or distress. The performance was continuing until the very end, with Ted determined to face death with the same controlled facade he had maintained throughout his adult life. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison was a small clinical room dominated by a large wooden electric chair known as Old Sparky, a device that had been used to execute dozens of condemned prisoners since its installation in 1924. The chair sat on a raised platform, visible through windows that allowed witnesses to observe the execution. Approximately 42 witnesses were present for Ted Bundy's execution, including journalists, law enforcement officials, representatives from the families of victims, and citizens who had won a lottery for the limited public seats. Outside the prison, hundreds of people had gathered, many of them celebrating the approaching execution with signs and chants. The atmosphere was carnival-like, with vendors selling t-shirts that read, "Burn Bundy Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." The crowd represented years of pent-up anger and a collective desire for justice that transcended normal social restraint. Ted was strapped into the electric chair at approximately 7 a.m. Leather restraints secured his arms, legs, and torso to the chair, preventing any movement. A metal skull cap containing an electrode was placed on his head, connected by wires to the electrical system that would deliver the fatal current. A sponge soaked in saline solution was placed between the electrode and Ted's scalp to improve conductivity and reduce burning. A leather mask was placed over Ted's face, concealing his final expression from the witnesses who watched through the glass. The preparations were methodical and professional, carried out by prison staff who had performed this ritual many times before. Superintendent Tom Barton asked Ted if he had any final words. Ted declined to make a statement to the assembled witnesses, but asked that a message be conveyed to his family and friends. His actual last words were spoken to his attorney, Jim Coleman, and FBI agent William Hagmeyer, who had conducted many of the final interviews with Ted. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The message was simple and unremarkable, containing no acknowledgement of his crimes, no apology to his victims or their families, no final confession or dramatic revelation. Ted Bundy would exit the world as he had lived in it, focused on his own needs and his own relationships, unable to genuinely empathize with the people whose lives he had destroyed. At 7:13 in the morning, Superintendent Barton gave the signal and the executioner activated the electric chair. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ted Bundy's body for approximately 1 minute, causing his body to strain against the leather restraints. The current was turned off briefly, then reactivated for a second cycle to ensure death had occurred. Witnesses reported seeing smoke rising from the electrode on Ted's head and smelling the odor of burning flesh. At 7:16 in the morning, 3 minutes after the current was first applied, Ted Bundy was pronounced dead by the prison physician. The man who had murdered at least 30 women, and possibly many more, who had terrorized communities across the country and escaped from custody twice, who had charmed and manipulated countless people throughout his life, was finally gone. The announcement of Ted's death triggered celebration outside the prison that was both cathartic and disturbing. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers and applause. Fireworks were set off. People embraced and congratulated each other as if they had witnessed a sporting victory rather than a state-sanctioned killing. The celebration reflected the intensity of public anger toward Ted Bundy and the collective relief that he could never kill again. But it also revealed something troubling about the human capacity for vengeance and the ease with which people can celebrate death, even when that death is deserved and lawful. The scene outside Florida State Prison on the morning of January 24th, 1989, showed both the best and the worst of human nature. The desire for justice and the dark pleasure some people take in punishment and suffering. For the families of Ted Bundy's victims, the execution brought a measure of closure, but could never fully heal the wounds his crimes had inflicted. Some family members attended the execution or gathered outside the prison, needing to witness the end of the man who had taken their daughters. Others chose to stay away, feeling that watching Ted die would not bring back their loved ones or ease their grief. The execution marked the end of a 15-year ordeal of trials and appeals and waiting, but it could not restore what had been lost. The daughters, sisters, and friends that Ted had murdered were still gone, their potential unfulfilled, their lives cut short by a man who saw them only as objects for his gratification. The legacy of Ted Bundy extends far beyond his death and the specific crimes he committed. He fundamentally changed how American society thinks about serial killers and personal safety. Before Ted Bundy, the public image of a serial killer was generally someone who was obviously disturbed or socially maladjusted, someone whose appearance or behavior clearly marked them as dangerous. Ted proved that the most dangerous predators can look completely normal, can be attractive and charming and intelligent, can function successfully in society while secretly committing horrific acts. This revelation created a paradigm shift in how people assess threat and danger, replacing the assumption that evil is easily recognizable with the understanding that it can hide behind the most pleasant of facades. The changes in personal safety education that followed Ted Bundy's crimes are still evident today. Young people are taught not to help strangers with tasks that require approaching a vehicle or going to an isolated location, no matter how harmless the request might seem. The fake injury technique that Ted used so successfully is now widely known and specifically taught as a red flag in safety courses. The cultural knowledge that attractive, well-spoken people can be dangerous has been internalized to the point where it seems obvious. But this was not common understanding before Ted Bundy demonstrated it so conclusively. His crimes created a permanent shift in social awareness that affects how people interact with strangers and assess potential threats. The true crime genre that dominates contemporary media owes much of its existence to the public fascination with Ted Bundy. The extensive television coverage of his trials created an appetite for detailed examinations of serial killers and their crimes that continues to drive countless documentaries, podcasts, books, and television series. The psychological analysis of Ted's motivations and methods established a template for how serial killers are discussed and understood in popular culture. The ongoing debate about whether Ted was born evil or made evil by his circumstances and experiences continues to generate discussion decades after his death. Ted Bundy became the prototype of the modern serial killer in popular imagination, the standard against which others are measured and compared. The question of how many women Ted Bundy actually murdered remains unanswered and likely unanswerable. The official count of 30 victims, the number Ted confessed to before his execution, is almost certainly a significant undercount. Investigators working on his case generally believe the real number was between 50 and 100, accounting for the years he was active, the geographic range of his crimes, and the numerous unsolved disappearances of young women during that period that fit his victim profile. But without bodies or evidence or confessions, these additional victims remain unidentified, their families never knowing with certainty what happened to their daughters. Ted took those secrets to his grave, perhaps enjoying one final exercise of power over the people who wanted answers. The families who never received confirmation about their missing loved ones face a particularly cruel form of suffering. They live in a state of permanent uncertainty, unable to fully grieve because some part of them still hopes their daughter might somehow still be alive. They see Ted Bundy's name in the news and wonder if he killed their loved one, but never confessed. They visit potential grave sites hoping to find remains that might bring closure. They exist in a limbo between hope and despair. Victimized by Ted Bundy, even though their connection to him was never officially confirmed. These hidden victims and their families represent the full scope of the damage one serial killer can inflict on society. Harm that extends far beyond the confirmed cases to touch everyone who lost someone during his years of hunting. Ted Bundy died believing he was special, that his intelligence and his crimes had elevated him above ordinary people and made him worthy of attention and study. He died thinking that his legacy would be one of criminal genius and dark charisma that would fascinate people for generations. But the real legacy of Ted Bundy is simply this. He was a man who lacked the capacity for empathy and human connection, who spent his life using and destroying other people in a futile attempt to fill the void inside himself. He was not special or unique. He was simply broken in ways that made him incompatible with civilized society. The young women he murdered were special, each of them with their own dreams and talents and potential that were stolen by a man who saw them only as objects. Their names and their stories deserve to be remembered. Linda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Rancourt, Kathy Parks, Brenda Ball, George Ann Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Carol Valenzuela, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Amy, Deborah Kent, Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Lynette Culver, Susan Curtis, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Diane Leach, among the many others whose identities remain unknown. The execution of Ted Bundy marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in American history, but it did not mark the end of the questions his life and crimes raised about the nature of evil, the failures of the criminal justice system, and the psychology of serial murder. Those questions continue to be debated and studied by criminologists, psychologists, law enforcement professionals, and the general public. Ted Bundy's crimes serve as a reminder that evil exists in the world, that some people are fundamentally incapable of the empathy and moral reasoning that allows human society to function. His life serves as a case study in how narcissism, entitlement, and the absence of conscience can combine to create a predator who destroys everything he touches. And his death serves as evidence that eventually, even the most charming and intelligent criminals face consequences for their actions. The story of Ted Bundy is ultimately not about one man's evil, but about the resilience of the victims who survived him, the dedication of the law enforcement officers who pursued him for years, and the strength of the families who endured unimaginable loss and still found ways to continue living. It is about the young women whose lives were stolen, and whose potential was never realized. Daughters and sisters and friends who deserve so much better than to become victims of a serial killer. Their stories matter more than his. Their lives had more value than his, and their memory deserves to outlast his infamy. Ted Bundy may have proven that evil doesn't always look like a monster, but the victims he left behind proved that courage and grace and dignity can survive even the worst that humanity has to offer. Ted Bundy's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. If you want to explore more dark chapters of history, check out our documentary on Jeffrey Dahmer next. Subscribe to Deep Sleep Documentary for weekly deep dives into history's most notorious figures. Sleep well if you can.